I am just a chronicler and welcome you to another video. Since I know many of you watch to relax and fall asleep, I thought it would be nice if you left a comment telling me where you're listening from and if it's raining there. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel if you're enjoying the episodes. Now, it's time to get comfortable, relax, and begin. I should have left earlier. That's what keeps running through my mind as I grip the steering wheel, my knuckles white in the dim glow of the dashboard. The clock reads 11:47 p.m., and the lonely stretch of highway ahead seems to stretch on forever. It wasn't supposed to be like this. I'd promised Mum I'd make it home for Dad's surprise birthday party. But work ran late, as usual, and by the time I hit the road, the sun had long since dipped below the horizon. Now, with nothing but miles of empty asphalt and the occasional glare of oncoming headlights, I'm starting to regret my decision to push through the night. I reach for my phone, thinking I should let Mum know I'm running behind. No signal, of course. These back roads cut through some of the most remote parts of the state. I toss the useless device onto the passenger seats and focus on the road ahead. That's when I first notice the headlights in my rearview mirror. At first, I don't think much of it. It's a public highway after all. But as the minutes tick by, I realize the car behind me isn't passing or falling back. It's just there, keeping pace, maintaining the same distance. I tap the brakes, slowing down a bit. The car slows too. "Come on, buddy," I mutter. "Just pass a righty," but they don't. The headlights remain fixed in my mirror, two piercing eyes boring into the back of my skull. I speed up a little, heart rate quickening. The car matches my speed perfectly. I try to rationalize it. Maybe they're just tired, using me as a guide through the darkness. Maybe they're worried about hitting a deer if they go any faster. But a nagging voice in the back of my mind whispers that something isn't right. I spot a turnoff ahead, a smaller road branching off into the woods. On impulse, I flick on my turn signal and make the turn. My followers hesitate for a moment, then take the turn as well. "Shit," I breathe, my palms growing sweaty on the wheel. This road is even darker, the trees pressing in on both sides. My headlights catch the gleam of animal eyes watching from the underbrush. I feel exposed, vulnerable. I drive for another 10 minutes, taking random turns whenever I can. But no matter what I do, those headlights stay with me. Sometimes they fall back a bit and I'll feel a flicker of hope. Then they're right there again, closer than ever. My mind races with possibilities. Road rage, some bored local kids playing a prank, or something worse. I think of all the stories I've heard about people running others off the road, about carjackings and worse. I grab my phone again, desperately hoping for a signal. Nothing. I'm on my own out here. The gaslight pings on, adding a new layer of dread to my situation. I'd meant to fill up at the last town, but in my hurry to make up time, I'd pushed on. Now I'm paying the price. I do some quick mental math. There should be another town coming up in about 30 miles. If I'm careful, I should just make it. But the margin for error is razor thin. I ease off the gas a little, trying to conserve fuel. The car behind me slows too, maintaining that same maddening distance. "What do you want?" I shout, knowing they can't hear me. My voice sounds shrill, panicked in the confines of the car. I take a deep breath, trying to steady myself. That's when I see the flashing lights ahead. Relief floods through me as I spot a police cruiser parked on the shoulder. I slowed down, ready to pull over and explain my situation. But as I get closer, I realize the cruiser is empty. There's no one around. I hesitate, torn between stopping and continuing on. The decision is made for me when I glance in the rearview mirror and see the car behind me accelerating. They're closing the gap fast. Heart pounding, I slam on the gas. My car lurches forward, engine whining in protest. The pursuers are right on my tail now. So close I can't even see their headlights in my mirrors anymore. I fly past the empty police cruiser, a hysterical laugh bubbling up in my throat. Some protection that turned out to be. My eyes flick constantly between the road ahead and the rearview mirror, terrified of what I might see gaining on me. The trees are a dark blur on either side. I take a curve too fast, feeling the car start to slide. For a heart-stopping moment, I'm sure I'm going to lose control. But somehow, I manage to wrestle the wheel and stay on the road. The adrenaline is really pumping now. My breath comes in short gasps, and I can feel sweat trickling down my back. I've never driven like this before, never felt this kind of fear. Ahead, I see lights. A town, finally. I feel a surge of hope. Surely my pursuers won't try anything with witnesses around. I push the car harder, eating up the last miles of empty road. As I enter the town limits, I'm already looking for somewhere to stop. A police station, a 24-hour diner, anywhere with people. But the streets are deserted, the buildings dark. It's a small town, the kind that rolls up the sidewalks at sundown. I slow down, peering desperately at each building I pass. There has to be something open. As my speed drops, I hear the car behind me getting closer again. I risk a glance in the mirror and feel my blood run cold. It's a police cruiser, the same one I passed on the side of the road earlier. My mind reels. How is that possible? I've been driving flat out since I passed it. There's no way it could have caught up so quickly. Unless it wasn't really parked back there at all. Unless this whole thing has been an elaborate setup. I'm so distracted by this realization that I almost missed the sign for a gas station up ahead. I hang a sharp right, tires squealing as I pull into the darkened lot. The pumps are off, the convenience store closed up tight. But it's something. I screech to a halt near the pumps and kill the engine. In the sudden silence, I can hear my own ragged breathing. I sit there for a moment, frozen, waiting to see what will happen next. The cruiser pulls in slowly, its headlights painting stark shadows across the empty lot. It stops a short distance away, engine idling. Neither of us moves. Minutes tick by. The standoff stretches on, unbearable in its tension. Finally, I can't take it anymore. With trembling hands, I reach for the door handle. As soon as my fingers touch the cool metal, the cruiser's lights flash once, bright enough to leave spots dancing in my vision. I squint, trying to make out any details of the driver, but the windshield is opaque, reflecting nothing but darkness. "Hello!" I call out, my voice sounding small and scared. "Officer, what's going on?" No response, just the low rumble of the cruiser's engine. I lick my dry lips, mind racing. Look, if I was speeding back there, I'm sorry. I thought someone was following me. Still nothing. The silence is oppressive, broken only by the pounding of my heart. Slowly, careful to keep my hands visible, I step out of the car. The night air is cool on my skin, raising goosebumps along my arms. I take a tentative step toward the cruiser. "Officer, is everything okay?" The driver's side door of the cruiser opens with a creak. A figure emerges, silhouetted against the headlights. I can't make out any features, just a vague human shape. "Ma'am," a voice calls out. It's distorted somehow, not quite natural. "I'm going to need you to return to your vehicle." I freeze, uncertainty coursing through me. Everything about this feels wrong. "Why?" I ask, hating how my voice shakes. "What's going on?" "Return to your vehicle now," the voice repeats, more forcefully this time. The figure takes a step forward, and I instinctively back up. "No," I say, surprising myself with my defiance. "Not until you tell me what this is about." The figure stops. For a long moment, neither of us moves. Then, slowly, they reach up and remove their hats. What I see makes my blood run cold. Where a face should be, there's only a swirling darkness, like a void given form. I open my mouth to scream, but no sound comes out. The thing that isn't an officer takes another step forward. "Last chance," it says, its voice now a horrifying blend of tones and pitches. "Get back in the car." My paralysis breaks. I turn and run, not toward my car, but into the darkness beyond the gas station. I hear footsteps behind me, unnaturally fast. As I plunge into the woods, branches whipping at my face, I realize the terrible truth. The long drive home isn't over. It's only just beginning. Story 2. The first thing I noticed about him was how little he had. Just a small duffel bag and a laptop case. For someone planning to stay a week, it seemed oddly sparse. But hey, I thought, maybe he's one of those minimalist types. "Welcome," I said, plastering on my best host smile. "I'm Sarah, and this is my husband, Tom." The man nodded, his own smile not quite reaching his eyes. "John," he said simply, extending a hand. His grip was firm, almost uncomfortably so. As Tom showed John to the guest room, I couldn't shake a nagging feeling of unease. There was something off about him, but I couldn't put my finger on what. Still, we'd had dozens of Airbnb guests before without incident. This would be fine, I told myself. Just fine. The first couple of days passed uneventfully. John was quiet, polite, and kept to himself. He'd leave early in the morning and return late at night. We barely saw him. It was on the third day that I noticed something odd. I was tidying up the living room when I realized the framed photo of Tom and me from our wedding day was slightly askew. Not by much, just an inch or so. But I distinctly remembered straightening all the photos the day before. I fixed it and thought nothing more of it. But the next day, it was crooked again. And this time, I was certain I hadn't touched it. "Tom," I asked over dinner that night, keeping my voice low, "have you been moving the photos in the living room?" He looked at me quizzically. "No. Why?" I explained what I'd noticed. Tom shrugged it off. "Probably just the vibrations from the street," he said. "You know how busy it gets during rush hour?" I nodded, but I wasn't convinced. Our street wasn't that busy, and none of the other photos had moved. That night, I had trouble sleeping. Every creak of the house, every distant car horn, set me on edge. I found myself straining to hear any movement from the guest room down the hall. The next morning, I was making coffee when John emerged from his room. He looked impeccable as always, not a hair out of place. "Good morning," I said, trying to keep my tone light. "Sleep well," he nodded. "Very well, thank you. Your home is so comfortable." The way he said comfortable sent a chill down my spine. It was almost like he was savoring the word. As he left for the day, I decided to do a little investigating. I know. It's not exactly ethical to snoop on your guests. but something felt off, and I needed to know why. I slipped into John's room, feeling like a criminal in my own home. The bed was made with military precision. The duffel bag sat at the foot of the bed, zipped tight. I hesitated for a moment, then opened it. Empty. Completely empty. My heart started racing. Where were his clothes, his toiletries? Surely he must have brought something for a week-long stay. I checked the closet. Nothing. The drawers. Empty. It was as if he'd never unpacked at all. I was so lost in my confused thoughts that I almost missed it. A small black notebook tucked between the mattress and box spring. With trembling hands, I pulled it out and opened it. Inside were pages and pages of meticulous notes. About our house. About our schedules. About us. Sarah leaves for work at 8:15 a.m. Returns at 5:45 p.m. Goes for a run on Tuesdays and Thursdays at 7 p.m. Tom works from home on Wednesdays. Likes to nap on the couch from 2 to 3 p.m. Master bedroom window faces east. Second floor bathroom window often left open. I snapped the notebook shut, feeling sick. This wasn't just weird anymore. This was dangerous. I heard the front door open. Panicking, I shoved the notebook back where I'd found it and rushed out of the room. I made it to the kitchen just as Tom walked in. "Hey, you okay?" he asked, taking in my flushed face. "You look like you've seen a ghost." I opened my mouth to tell him everything, but something stopped me. What if I was overreacting? What if there was a perfectly reasonable explanation for all of this? "I'm fine," I lied. "Just a little warm in here." That night, I tossed and turned, the contents of that notebook playing on repeat in my mind. I must have drifted off eventually, because the next thing I knew, I was waking up to the sound of footsteps in the hallway. I glanced at the clock. 3:17 a.m. My heart began to race. "Tom," I whispered, shaking my husband awake. "Tom, there's someone in the hall." He sat up groggily. "Wah, it's probably just John going to the bathroom." But the footsteps weren't heading toward the bathroom. They were moving up and down the hall, slow and deliberate, like someone pacing or looking for something. We lay there in tense silence, listening. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, the footsteps retreated, and a door closed softly. "See?" Tom said, already fallen back asleep. Nothing to worry about, but there was plenty to worry about. The next morning, things around the house were just off. The throw pillows on the couch had been rearranged. A drawer in the kitchen was open a crack. And that damn wedding photo was crooked again. I cornered Tom before he left for work. "We need to talk about John," I said. Tom sighed. "Sarah, we've been over this. He's a paying guest. We can't just kick him out because you've got a bad feeling. It's not just a feeling," I insisted, and told him about the empty bag, the notebook, the footsteps in the night. Tom's face grew serious as I spoke. "Okay," he said finally. "That is weird. I'll call Airbnb today and see what our options are." I felt a wave of relief wash over me. Finally, he was taking this seriously. But when Tom got home that evening, he had bad news. Airbnb says we can't just evict him without cause. We'd need actual evidence of wrongdoing. "The notebook isn't evidence?" I asked incredulously. Tom shook his head. "We'd have to prove it was his, and that he was using it for nefarious purposes. Look, his booking is up in 2 days. Let's just wait it out. We'll be extra vigilant, okay?" I wanted to argue, but I knew he was right. We just had to get through 2 more days. That night, I double-checked every lock in the house. As I was finishing up, I noticed John watching me from the doorway of his room. "Everything okay?" he asked, his tone concerned but his eyes empty. I forced a smile. "Oh yes, just a bit paranoid, I guess. You can never be too careful these days." He nodded slowly. "No, you certainly can't. Good night, Sarah." I barely slept that night, jerking awake at every little sound. The next day passed in a haze of anxiety and too much coffee. That evening, as Tom and I were making dinner, John approached us. "I hate to be a bother," he said, "but I've had a bit of a situation come up. Would it be possible for me to extend my stay by another week?" I felt the blood drain from my face. Tom glanced at me, then back at John. "I'm sorry," he said smoothly, "but we actually have another booking coming in. We won't be able to accommodate an extension." John's face remained impassive, but something flashed in his eyes. "Anger. Disappointment, I see," he said. "Well, thank you anyway." As he turned to go, I blurted out, "Why do you need to stay longer?" He paused, looking back at me with that empty smile. "Oh, you know how it is. Sometimes things just don't go according to plan." That night was the longest of my life. Every creak, every shadow had me on high alert. I must have checked on our sleeping kids a dozen times. Morning finally came. As Tom and I sat at the kitchen table, clutching our coffee mugs like lifelines, we heard movement from John's room. He emerged a few minutes later, duffel bag in hand. "Well," he said, "I guess this is goodbye. Thank you for your hospitality." We mumbled our goodbyes, watching as he walked to the front door. As he opened it, he turned back one last time. "You have a lovely home," he said, his eyes scanning the room slowly. "So comfortable." And then he was gone. We changed the locks that day, filed a report with Airbnb and the police for all the good it would do. Life slowly returned to normal, but something had changed. Our home no longer felt like the safe haven it once was. A week later, we received a package. Inside was a single key, a copy of our old house key, and a note. "Thanks for having me. I'll be sure to come back soon." We moved out the next day. Some might call it an overreaction, but they didn't see that empty duffel bag. They didn't read that notebook. They didn't feel those eyes, watching, always watching. Sometimes I still wake up in the middle of the night, straining to hear footsteps in the hallway, and I wonder, where is John now? And whose home is he making himself comfortable in? Story 3. The first image was unremarkable. Just another grainy shot of a deer passing through the frame, its eyes glowing in the infrared flash. It was the kind of photo I'd seen 1,000 times before, but as I flicked through the memory card's contents, my blood ran cold. Something was very, very wrong in these woods. But let me back up a bit. My name's Mike, and I'm a wildlife biologist. For the past month, I'd been setting up trail cameras in the Elkhorn National Forest, tracking the movement patterns of the local deer population. It was routine work, boring, even. Wake up at dawn, hike out to check the cameras, swap memory cards, move on to the next location, rinse and repeat. That particular morning had started like any other. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and last night's rain. Mist clung to the forest floor, giving everything an ethereal quality. As I trudged through the underbrush, my boots squelching in the damp earth, I felt that familiar sense of solitude that comes with being miles from civilization. I reached the first camera site just as the sun was starting to peek through the canopy. Shafts of golden light cut through the mist, creating a scene that would have been beautiful if not for the gnawing unease in my gut. Something felt off. I shook it off, chalking it up to too much coffee and not enough sleep. Crouching down, I popped open the camera's housing and swapped out the memory card. That's when I noticed the scratches around the lens. Deep gouges in the plastic, like something had been clawing at it. Probably just a curious bear, I muttered to myself. But even as I said it, I knew that wasn't right. The marks were too precise, too deliberate. I hurried through the rest of my rounds, that sense of wrongness growing with each step. By the time I made it back to my cabin, my shirt was soaked with sweat despite the cool morning air. Hands shaking slightly, I plugged the first memory card into my laptop, and that's when things got weird. The first few dozen photos were normal. Deer, the occasional coyote, nothing out of the ordinary. But then, about halfway through, something changed. There, in the background of an otherwise mundane shot of a rabbit, was a figure. It was blurry, partially obscured by the trees, but unmistakably humanoid. My first thought was that it was just another hiker who'd wandered into frame. But as I flipped to the next photo, taken only seconds later according to the timestamp, my breath caught in my throat. The figure was closer now, much closer, though still out of focus. It seemed to be looking directly at the camera. My finger hovered over the next key, a part of me not wanting to see what came next. But curiosity won out over fear, and I pressed on. The next shot made my heart skip a beat. The figure was now in the foreground, taking up most of the frame. It was still blurry, but I could make out more details now. Long, lanky limbs, pale, almost translucent skin, and those eyes. God, those eyes. They glowed in the camera's flash, not with the usual red-eye effect, but with an unnatural, piercing blue. I slammed the laptop shut, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. This had to be some kind of joke, right? Maybe one of the other researchers playing a prank. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. Whatever I'd seen in those photos, it wasn't human. I spent the rest of the day in a daze, alternating between poring over the photos and convincing myself I was overreacting. By the time night fell, I'd almost managed to rationalize it all away. Almost. Sleep didn't come easy that night. Every creak of the cabin, every rustle of wind through the trees, had me sitting bolt upright, straining my ears for any sign of what? I didn't even know what I was afraid of. Morning came, and with it, a sense of determination. I needed answers, and there was only one way to get them. I had to go back out there. This time, I came prepared. Along with my usual gear, I packed a hefty hunting knife and a can of bear spray. It wasn't much, but it made me feel a little better as I set out into the misty woods. The hike to the first camera seemed to take forever. Every shadow looked like a lurking figure. Every snapping twig sounded like footsteps. When I finally reached the site, I half expected to find the camera destroyed, but it was intact, silently keeping its vigil. With trembling hands, I swapped out the memory card. As I was closing up the housing, a flicker of movement caught my eye. I spun around, heart pounding, but there was nothing there. Just trees and mist. Get a grip, Mike, I muttered to myself. You're letting your imagination run wild. But as I turned back to the camera, I froze. There, pressed into the soft earth, right next to my boot print, was another footprint. It was long, far too long to be human, with strange, elongated toes. I didn't even bother checking the other cameras. I just ran, crashing through the underbrush with no regard for stealth or direction. All I knew was that I needed to get back to the cabin, back to safety. By the time I burst through the cabin door, I was gasping for air, my legs burning from the frantic sprint. I slammed the door shut, throwing the deadbolt for good measure. It took me a good hour to calm down enough to think rationally. Once my hands stopped shaking, I forced myself to plug in the new memory card. I had to know. The first few photos were normal, maddeningly so. But then, just like before, it appeared. This time, there was no slow progression. It was there, front and center, staring directly into the camera. The image was clearer this time, and what I saw chilled me to my core. The figure was tall, impossibly tall, with limbs that seemed too long for its body. Its skin was pale and waxy, stretched tight over an angular frame. But it was the face that truly horrified me. It was almost featureless, save for those glowing blue eyes and the mouth that was far too wide, filled with needle-like teeth. I must have sat there for hours, flipping through the photos. In each one, it was closer, its unnatural face filling more and more of the frame. In the final shot, all I could see were those eyes, boring into me through the screen. That's when I noticed the time stamp on the last photo. 10:17 a.m. I glanced at my watch. 10:16 a.m. A knock at the door made me jump out of my skin. Slow, deliberate, 3 sharp raps. "Hello," I called out, my voice cracking. No response. Just another 3 knocks, slightly louder this time. I stood on shaky legs, inching towards the door. A part of me screamed to run, to hide, but a morbid curiosity pushed me forward. I had to know. Reaching out, I grasped the doorknob. The metal was ice cold against my palm. Taking a deep breath, I turned it slowly and pulled the door open a crack. Nothing, just the empty porch and the misty forest beyond. I let out a shaky laugh, relief flooding through me. It was all in my head. I was letting my fears get the better of me. That's when I saw it. A single, elongated footprint in the mud just beyond the porch steps. Freshly made. I slammed the door shut, fumbling with the lock. My mind was reeling, unable to process what was happening. This couldn't be real. It couldn't be. A soft thud from the roof made me look up. Dust drifted down from the ceiling as something heavy moved across the shingles. It was on the roof. Oh God, it was on the roof. I scrambled for my satellite phone, punching in the emergency number with trembling fingers. It rang once, twice, 3 times. On the 4th ring, it connected. "Emergency services, what's your..." The line went dead. I stared at the phone in disbelief, willing it to come back to life. But the screen remained dark. Another thud, this time from the back of the cabin. Then another, closer now. It was toying with me, letting me know it was there, letting me know there was no escape. I retreated to the bedroom, grabbing my hunting knife from the bedside table, for all the good it would do me against whatever this thing was. As I huddled in the corner, knife clutched to my chest, I heard it. A slow, scraping sound coming from the living room window. The sound of long nails on glass. I squatted down, closing my eyes tight and praying to whatever God might be listening. The scraping stopped, replaced by a new sound. A low, guttural clicking that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Then, silence. Complete and utter silence. I don't know how long I sat there, frozen in terror. Minutes, hours, Time seemed to have lost all meaning. Eventually, I gathered the courage to open my eyes. The bedroom was empty, bathed in the warm glow of the afternoon sun. Had I fallen asleep, dreamed it all? With shaky legs, I made my way to the living room. Everything was as I'd left it. No sign of any disturbance. I let out a long, relieved breath. It had all been in my head. A vivid nightmare brought on by stress and isolation. That's when I saw it. There, on the coffee table, next to my closed laptop, was a memory card. One I knew for certain I hadn't left there. As I stared at it, my phone buzzed with a new email notification. The subject line made my blood run cold. Thought you might want these back. See you again soon. I looked up from my phone, out the window to the forest beyond. And there, just at the tree line, I caught a glimpse of something pale moving in the shadows. Something with glowing blue eyes. It wasn't over. It was just beginning. Story 4. The first time I heard the footsteps, I thought I was imagining things. It was 2:37 a.m., that dead zone in the middle of the night when the world feels like it's holding its breath. I was on my usual rounds, flashlight beam cutting through the darkness of the empty office building. The sound echoed from somewhere above me, a slow, deliberate cadence that sent a chill down my spine. I'm not easily spooked. You can't be in this line of work. But something about those footsteps made my skin crawl. They were too measured, too purposeful for a building that should have been empty, save for me. My name's Alex, and I've been working security at Meridian Tower for the past 6 months. It's not a glamorous job, but it pays the bills. Most nights, it's mind-numbingly boring. Just me, endless corridors, and the occasional skittering of a mouse in the walls. But that night was different. I keyed my radio, trying to keep my voice steady. "Hey Frank, you copy?" Static crackled for a moment before Frank's gruff voice came through. "Yeah, what's up?" Frank was my supervisor, monitoring the security feeds from the basement. He'd been here for years and had seen it all, or so he claimed. I just heard footsteps on the floor above me. Anyone else supposed to be in the building tonight? There was a pause, longer than I would have liked. "Negative," Frank finally replied. "Building's empty. You sure it wasn't just the pipes settling?" I wanted to believe that. God, how I wanted to believe that. But deep down, I knew what I'd heard. "Yeah, must have been," I lied, not wanting to sound paranoid on my first solo night shift. "I'll keep an eye out anyway." "You do that?" Frank said, a note of amusement in his voice. "Let me know if you see any ghosts." I forced a chuckle and clicked off the radio. Ghosts, right. If only it were that simple. The rest of the night passed without incident, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every shadow seemed to move. Every reflection in the windows looked just a little off. By the time my shift ended at 6 a.m., I was a bundle of frayed nerves. As I was clocking out, Frank gave me a knowing smirk. "So, did the bogeyman get you?" I rolled my eyes, playing it cool. "Ha ha. You're hilarious, Frank." But as I drove home in the pale morning light, those footsteps kept echoing in my mind. The next few nights were quiet, almost suspiciously so. I started to think maybe Frank was right, that I'd just let my imagination run wild that first night. But then, exactly a week later, it happened again. This time, I was in the lobby, my boots squeaking on the polished marble floor. The massive wall of windows reflected the city lights, creating the illusion that the darkness outside was alive, writhing with pinpricks of light. That's when I saw it. A flicker of movement on the mezzanine above. Just for a second, but unmistakable. A shadow, person-shaped, darting behind a pillar. My heart leapt into my throat. "Hello," I called out, my voice sounding small in the cavernous space. "This is security. Identify yourself." Silence. Not even an echo. I took the stairs 2 at a time, hand on my taser. But when I reached the mezzanine, there was no one there. Just empty space and that persistent feeling of being watched. I spent the rest of the night on edge, jumping at every little sound. When I reported it to Frank in the morning, he just shrugged it off. "Probably just a reflection from outside," he said, not even looking up from his crossword puzzle. "This job will make you see things if you let it." But I knew what I'd seen, and I was determined to get to the bottom of it. Over the next few weeks, the incidents escalated. Lights would flicker on in rooms I'd just checked. Doors I knew I'd locked would be standing open. And always that feeling of being followed, of eyes boring into the back of my skull. I started doing research during the day, digging into the building's history. Meridian Tower was only 10 years old, so there were no spooky legends or tragic deaths to explain what was happening. Just a normal, if slightly pretentious, office building. It was driving me crazy. I wasn't sleeping well, jumping at every little noise even when I was at home. My girlfriend, Jen, was starting to notice. "Alex, what's going on with you?" she asked one night over dinner. "You've been acting weird for weeks." I wanted to tell her everything, but how could I? She'd think I was losing it. Hell, maybe I was. "Just stress from work," I said, forcing a smile. "You know how it is." She didn't look convinced, but she let it drop. I hated lying to her, but what choice did I have? As the weeks wore on, I started to dread going to work. Each night felt like walking into a trap, like something was waiting for me in the darkness. But I needed this job, and I was too stubborn to quit. So I kept going, night after night, waiting for the other shoe to drop. And then, last night, it finally did. It started like any other shift. I clocked in, nodded to Frank as he headed out, and began my rounds. The first few hours were quiet, almost peaceful. But as midnight approached, that familiar sense of unease started to creep in. I was on the 14th floor when I heard it, that same measured footstep from weeks ago. But this time, it was closer, much closer. I spun around, flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. For a split second, I caught a glimpse of something. A figure, tall and unnaturally thin, slipping around a corner. "Hey," I shouted, breaking into a run. "Stop right there." I rounded the corner, but the hallway was empty. My flashlight beam trembled as I swept it back and forth, my breath coming in short gasps. That's when the lights started to flicker. One by one, the fluorescent panels in the ceiling began to pulse, creating a strobe effect that made the shadows dance. And in those flashes of darkness, I saw it again. Closer now, its form becoming clearer with each pulse of light. It was human-shaped, but wrong somehow. Too tall, too thin, its limbs at odd angles. And its face. In that brief moment I saw it. I felt my sanity start to slip. It was like looking at static on an old TV, constantly shifting and reforming. I ran. God help me, I ran like I've never run before. Down the emergency stairs, taking them 3 at a time, my footsteps echoing in the stairwell. But no matter how fast I went, I could hear it behind me. Not running, but walking with that same measured pace, like it knew it would catch me eventually. I burst out of the stairwell on the ground floor, gasping for air. The lobby was dark, the only light coming from the exit signs and the city beyond the windows. As I stumbled towards the front desk, movement caught my eye. The security monitors, each one showing a different floor of the building, and on every screen, in every hallway and room, there it was, staring directly at the camera, staring at me. I fumbled for my radio with shaking hands. Frank, do you copy? There's something in the building. Static, just endless static. A soft ding made me freeze. The elevator. I turned slowly, watching as the numbers above the door lit up one by one, coming down, coming for me. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, just stood there, transfixed, as the numbers ticked lower and lower. 3, 2, 1. The door slid open with a cheerful chime that seemed obscene in the circumstances. And there it stood. A void in the shape of a man, darkness given form. Those shifting, static-filled features focused on me, and I felt something inside me break. I don't remember much after that. I have flashes, running through the streets, my uniform torn and dirty, pounding on Jen's door in the early hours of the morning, babbling incoherently. The concerned faces of the paramedics as they loaded me into the ambulance. They're calling it a psychotic break. Stress-induced, they say. Too many nights alone in that big empty building. They've got me on medication now, dulling the edges of the world. Jen visits every day, worry etched on her face. She tries to be supportive, but I can see the fear in her eyes. Fear of what I've become. Frank came by once, told me to take all the time I need, that my job would be waiting for me when I'm better, as if I could ever set foot in that building again. But the worst part, the part that keeps me awake at night, staring at the shadows in the corners of my hospital room, I don't think it's over. Sometimes, late at night when the ward is quiet, I hear it. That slow, measured footstep in the hallway outside my door. And I know, with a certainty that chills me to my core, that it followed me here. That it's just biding its time, waiting for the lights to go out. Story 5. I first noticed him on a Tuesday. It was just past dusk, that liminal time when the world seems to hold its breath between day and night. I was watering the hydrangeas in my front yard when movement caught my eye. There he was, standing motionless on his porch across the street, staring directly at me. Our gazes locked for a moment that felt like an eternity, before he turned and disappeared into his house. I shrugged it off at first. After all, he was new to the neighborhood. Probably just curious about his neighbors. But as the days went by, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. My name's Emily, and I've lived in this quiet suburban cul-de-sac for the past 5 years. It's the kind of place where everyone knows everyone else's business, where the biggest excitement is usually Mrs. Johnson's prize-winning petunias. So when the Ferguson house across the street sold after sitting empty for months, it was big news. The new owner moved in on a Sunday. I baked a batch of my famous snickerdoodles as a welcome gift, but when I went to deliver them, no one answered the door. I left them on the porch with a note. The next day, the plate was back on my own porch, empty and scrubbed clean. No thank you note, no neighborly visit, just that gleaming, empty plate. That's when the watching started. I'd catch glimpses of him at odd hours, always standing perfectly still, always staring at my house. Sometimes from his porch, sometimes from an upstairs window. Once, I swore I saw him standing at the edge of my own backyard in the middle of the night, but when I blinked, he was gone. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe he worked nights and had a weird sleep schedule. Maybe he was just socially awkward. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. About a week after he moved in, I found the first gift. It was a small, intricately carved wooden box left on my front steps. Inside was a single white feather and a note written in an elegant, old-fashioned script. For Emily, who waters the flowers at dusk. I'll admit, a part of me was intrigued. It was an oddly romantic gesture, if a bit creepy. But as the gifts continued to appear, that intrigue turned to unease. A bouquet of wildflowers I'd never seen before, with petals that seemed to glow in the dark. A vintage hand mirror that showed strange, shifting shadows when you looked into it. A small, leather-bound book filled with writing in a language I couldn't understand. Each gift was accompanied by a note, each more personal than the last. For Emily, who sings in the shower every morning at 7:15. For Emily, who prefers Earl Grey tea with a splash of milk, no sugar. For Emily, who talks in her sleep about the ocean. How did he know these things? I started double-checking my locks, closing my curtains tight at night. I considered calling the police, but what would I say? My neighbor leaves me creepy gifts and watches my house. They'd laugh me off the phone. I tried talking to other neighbors about him, but no one seemed to have met him. Mrs. Johnson swore she'd seen moving trucks, but couldn't remember what the new neighbor looked like. Old Mr. Peters insisted the house was still empty. It was like he existed in some strange blind spot, visible only to me. As the weeks went by, my sense of reality started to fray at the edges. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, certain I'd heard footsteps in the hall or seen a shadow move across my bedroom wall. More than once, I could have sworn I saw him standing at the foot of my bed. But when I turned on the light, there was nothing there. I stopped sleeping, stopped eating. My friends started to worry, told me I looked pale, asked if everything was okay, but how could I explain? How could I make them understand the constant, gnawing fear that had taken root in my life? Then came the night that changed everything. I'd finally managed to fall into a fitful sleep when a noise jolted me awake. A soft thud, like something being set down gently. It was coming from the kitchen. My heart pounding, I crept downstairs, phone in hand, ready to call 911. The kitchen was dark, moonlight spilling in through the window above the sink. And there, on the counter, was another gift. A small, ornate bird cage. Inside, a delicate mechanical bird, its gears visible through crystal feathers. As I watched, paralyzed, it began to move. Its head turned towards me, jeweled eyes glinting in the moonlight. And then, impossibly, it began to sing. The melody was haunting, unlike anything I'd ever heard. It filled the kitchen, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I stood there, transfixed, as the song wove its way into my mind. I don't know how long I listened. It could have been minutes or hours. But suddenly, a movement outside the window snapped me back to reality. There he was, standing in my backyard, staring up at me. Even in the dim light, I could see he was smiling. That's when I ran. I didn't stop to grab anything, just bolted out the front door in my pajamas and bare feet. I ran until my lungs burned, until the familiar streets of my neighborhood gave way to parts of town I'd never seen before. Finally, exhausted, I collapsed on a bus stop bench. As the adrenaline faded, the reality of my situation started to sink in. I was alone, in the middle of the night, with no phone, no money, and no idea where I was. I'd let my fear drive me from my own home. But as I sat there, trying to figure out what to do next, a thought occurred to me. In all those weeks of gifts and watching and creeping fear, had he ever actually done anything threatening? Had he ever tried to harm me, or even speak to me? I thought about those meticulously chosen gifts, those notes that showed he'd been paying attention to the little details of my life. Was it possible I'd misinterpreted everything? Had I let my imagination run wild, turning an awkward but well-meaning neighbor into some kind of bogeyman? With a mix of embarrassment and determination, I started the long walk home. The sky was just starting to lighten as I turned onto my street. And there he was, standing on his porch, watching me approach. For the first time, I really looked at him. He was older than I'd thought, with silver hair and kind eyes that crinkled at the corners. He looked normal, ordinary, even. As I got closer, he smiled. Not the menacing grin I'd imagined that night in the kitchen, but a warm, almost shy expression. "Hello, Emily," he said, his voice gentle. "I was worried about you." I stopped at the foot of his porch steps, my heart racing, but for a different reason now. I'm sorry," I stammered. "I think I may have misunderstood." He held up a hand, shaking his head. "No, I'm the one who should apologize. I realize now how my actions must have seemed. I'm not very good with people, you see," I thought. Well, I thought the gifts might be a way to connect, to show I'd noticed you. But I see now how frightening that must have been. As he spoke, I felt the weeks of fear and paranoia start to melt away. In their place came a wave of relief, so strong it made my knees weak. "Why don't you come in?" he asked, gesturing to his front door. "I've just made some tea, Earl Grey, if I remember correctly. We could talk, get to know each other properly." I hesitated for a moment, years of ingrained caution warring with my newfound understanding. But something in his eyes, a mixture of hope and nervousness, made my decision for me. "I'd like that," I said, climbing the steps. As I followed him into the house, I couldn't help but marvel at how quickly everything had changed. How a simple conversation could transform a nightmare into, well, I wasn't sure what yet, but I was eager to find out. The inside of his house was cozy, filled with books and strange, beautiful objects that I realized must be his own creations. As we sat down with our tea, he began to tell me his story. He was an inventor, he explained, specializing in mechanical curiosities. He'd moved to our quiet neighborhood looking for peace and inspiration. "I saw you that first day," he said, a hint of color touching his cheeks. "Watering your flowers in the fading light. You looked so serene, so at home. I wanted to capture that feeling, to create something that might bring you joy. But I'm afraid I went about it all wrong." As he spoke, I felt the last of my fear dissipate. In its place grew something new, a spark of interest, of connection. We talked for hours about his inventions, about my work, about life and art and the strange ways people try to reach out to one another. When I finally left, the sun was high in the sky. As I walked back to my house, I felt lighter than I had in weeks. The world seemed brighter, full of possibility. That night, as I was getting ready for bed, I heard a soft melody drifting through my open window. I looked out to see my neighbor, Robert, I now knew, standing in his yard. In his hands was a small music box, playing that same haunting tune I'd heard from the mechanical bird. He looked up, meeting my eyes, and smiled. I smiled back, feeling a warmth spread through my chest. As I closed the window, I realized that sometimes the things we fear most are simply the unknown, waiting to be understood. And sometimes a nightmare can turn into a new beginning, if only we have the courage to look closer. Story 6. The moment I stepped onto the subway car, I knew something was off. It wasn't just the eerie quiet or the flickering fluorescent lights. It was the man sitting at the far end, his face hidden beneath the brim of a fedora. As the doors hissed shut behind me, I felt a chill run down my spine. Little did I know, this would be the longest ride of my life. My name's Jake, and I've been taking the midnight train home from my bartending gig for years. Usually, it's a boring trip. Just me, a few other night owls, and the rhythmic clacking of wheels on tracks. But tonight was different. I made my way down the aisle, my footsteps echoing in the empty car. The man in the fedora didn't move, didn't even seem to breathe. As I passed him, I caught a whiff of something metallic, like old pennies. I settled into a seat about halfway down the car, keeping one eye on the stranger. The train lurched forward, the familiar screech of metal on metal filling the air. As we plunged into the darkness of the tunnel, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. At the next stop, the doors opened with a pneumatic sigh. A woman stepped on, her high heels clicking against the floor. She was dressed for the office, which struck me as odd given the late hour. As she sat down across from me, I noticed something strange. She looked exactly like the man in the fedora. Same pale skin, same sharp cheekbones, same eerily blank expression. The only difference was her long hair and feminine attire. She didn't acknowledge me or the other passenger, just stared straight ahead with glassy eyes. I felt my heartbeat quicken. This had to be a coincidence, right? Maybe they were siblings or something. But as the train rolled on to the next station, my unease grew. At the third stop, a businessman got on. Suit, tie, briefcase, the whole 9 yards. And as he turned to sit, I saw his face. It was identical to the other 2 passengers. Same features, same vacant stare. My palms were sweating now, my breath coming in short gasps. I wanted to say something, to ask what the hell was going on, but my voice seemed stuck in my throat. The pattern continued at each stop. One by one, people who looked exactly alike filed onto the train. Men, women, young, old, all with the same face, all moving with the same robotic precision. And none of them looked at me, not once. By the time we reached the 8th stop, the car was half full. The air felt thick, oppressive, like the atmosphere before a thunderstorm. The identical passengers sat silently, their blank eyes staring at nothing. I couldn't take it anymore. I stood up, my legs shaking, and made my way to the doors. I didn't care where we were. I just knew I had to get off this train. But as I reached for the emergency exit lever, a hand grabbed my wrist. I turned, coming face to face with one of the clone-like passengers. His grip was like iron, his skin cold as ice. "Please remain seated," he said, his voice a monotone that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "We haven't reached your stop yet." I tried to pull away, but his grip only tightened. "Let go of me," I shouted, my voice sounding thin and panicky in the confined space. What the hell is going on here? But he just smiled a horrible, empty smile that never reached his eyes, and pushed me back into my seat. As I fell back, I noticed something that turned my blood to ice. His eyes, which I'd thought were just glassy and unfocused, had no pupils. They were completely white, like polished marbles. The train rolled on, and I sat there, paralyzed with fear. At each stop, more of the identical passengers boarded. They filled every seat, lined the aisles, pressed in around me until I could barely breathe. I lost track of time, of how many stops we'd passed. The world outside the windows had gone completely dark. No signs of the city visible anymore. It was like we were traveling through an endless void. Just when I thought I couldn't take any more, when the press of bodies and the silence and those horrible blank eyes had pushed me to the brink of screaming, the train began to slow. A voice crackled over the intercom, but it wasn't the usual automated announcement. It was a chorus of voices, all speaking in that same flat monotone I'd heard earlier. "Final stop," they said in unison. Everyone must exit. The doors opened with a hiss, but instead of a platform, there was only darkness beyond. A darkness so complete, so absolute, that it seemed to swallow the light from the train car. The identical passengers began to file out, moving with that same eerie synchronization. As they stepped into the darkness, they simply disappeared, like they were being erased from existence. I pressed myself back against the window, heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. "No," I whispered. "No, this isn't real. This can't be happening." But it was happening. And as the last of the clone-like passengers exited, leaving me alone in the car, I heard that chorus of voices again. "Your stop, Jake. Time to get off." I froze. How did they know my name? A figure appeared in the doorway, silhouetted against the darkness beyond. It was the first passenger, the man in the fedora. He extended a hand towards me, that terrible, empty smile on his face. "Come," he said, his voice now a cacophony of all the voices I'd heard before. "We've been waiting for you." In that moment, I made a decision. With a surge of adrenaline, I lunged past him, pushing him aside with strength born of desperation. I ran down the aisle of the train, hoping against hope to find another exit, another way out. But as I reached the end of the car, I found only another open door, and beyond it, more of the identical figures, stretching back as far as I could see. They stood silently, watching me with those pupilless eyes, those empty smiles. I turned, ready to run back the other way, but stopped short. The man in the fedora was there, blocking my path. And behind him, filling the car, were more of the clones. I was surrounded. "Why fight it, Jake?" the fedora man asked, his voice almost gentle now. "This is where you belong. With us. Part of us." As he spoke, I felt a strange sensation come over me, a numbness that started in my fingers and toes, slowly spreading up my limbs. I looked down at my hands and nearly screamed. My skin was turning pale, my fingers elongating to match those of the clones. "No!" I shouted, but my voice was changing too, taking on that same flat monotone. "This isn't real. It's a dream. It has to be a dream." The fedora man stepped closer, reaching out to me. "It's time to wake up, Jake. Wake up and join us." His hand touched my forehead, and suddenly, everything went white. I jolted awake with a gasp, my heart racing. I was in my bed, sunlight streaming through the window. Just a dream. It was just a dream. But as I sat up, trying to shake off the lingering terror, I noticed something on my nightstand. A fedora, one I'd never seen before. And pinned to it, a note written in handwriting identical to my own. "See you on tonight's ride." My blood ran cold as I realized the truth. It wasn't over. The nightmare was just beginning. I called in sick to work that day, spent hours pacing my apartment, jumping at every sound. As night fell, I found myself standing at the subway entrance, staring down into the flickering, fluorescent-lit tunnel. Part of me wanted to run, to pack a bag and leave the city, never look back. But a deeper, more primal part knew it wouldn't matter. They'd find me. They'd always find me. So I took a deep breath, straightened the fedora on my head, and descended the steps. As I swiped my Metro card and passed through the turnstile, I couldn't help but smile. A wide, empty smile that never quite reached my eyes. After all, I had a train to catch, and this time, I knew exactly where my stop would be. Story 7. The first message seemed innocent enough. Hey, I noticed you like the midnight too. What's your favorite song? I smiled, pleasantly surprised to find another fan of the synthwave band in my small town subreddit. Little did I know that this simple interaction would spiral into the most terrifying experience of my life. My name's Zoe, and I'm your typical 17-year-old high school senior. Well, maybe not totally typical. I'm more of the stay-at-home and binge Netflix type than the go-out and party type. Which is probably why I was so excited when your Midnight Rider 85 messaged me that Friday night. We hit it off immediately, bonding over our shared love of 80s-inspired music and cheesy sci-fi movies. It was refreshing to talk to someone who got my obscure references and didn't make me feel like a weirdo for preferring synthesizers to whatever was trending on TikTok. As the nights went on, our conversations deepened. Midnight Rider 85, Mike, as he asked me to call him, seemed to understand me in a way no one else did. He laughed at my dumb jokes, sympathized with my frustrations about school and my parents, and always knew just what to say to make me feel better when I was down. It was about 2 weeks into our friendship when things started to get weird. We were chatting about our daily routines, and I mentioned how I always stopped at Joe's Cafe for a caramel latte before school. "Oh yeah?" Mike replied. "The one on Oak Street, right?" With the red awning, I felt a little jolt in my stomach. I hadn't mentioned the street name or any details about the cafe, but I brushed it off. Maybe I had mentioned it before and forgot. "That's the one," I typed back. "How'd you know?" There was a long pause before his reply came through. "Lucky guess. Lots of cafes have red awnings." I let it go, but something about the interaction left me feeling uneasy. A few days later, we were discussing music again, and I mentioned how I'd love to learn to play the guitar. "That'd be awesome," Mike responded. "You could practice in your room. The acoustics would be great with those high ceilings." My blood ran cold. I definitely hadn't told him about my room. "How do you know about my room?" I asked, my fingers trembling as I typed. Another long pause. "Oh, didn't you mention it before? My bad if I'm mixing you up with someone else." I wanted to believe him. I really did. But that nagging feeling in my gut was getting harder to ignore. The next day at school, I couldn't focus on anything. My mind kept replaying our conversations, trying to figure out if I had let more slip than I realized. During lunch, my best friend Amber noticed my distraction. "Earth 2, Zoe," she said, waving a hand in front of my face. "What's up with you today?" I hesitated, then spilled everything. The online friendship, the weird comments, my growing unease. Amber listened, her expression growing more concerned. "Zoe," she said slowly, "this sounds really sketchy. I think you should stop talking to this guy." Deep down, I knew she was right, but another part of me didn't want to believe it. Mike had become such an important part of my life in such a short time. The thought of cutting him off made my chest ache. I'll be more careful, I promised Amber. If anything else weird happens, I'll block him. She didn't look convinced, but she let it go. That night, I was more guarded in my conversation with Mike. I kept things surface level, avoiding any personal details. He seemed to notice the change, asking if everything was okay. Yeah, just tired, I lied. Long day at school? Ah, I get that, he replied. Hey, maybe this will cheer you up. I wrote a little song for you. Before I could respond, a link popped up in the chat. Curiosity overrode my caution, and I clicked it. The melody that filled my room was hauntingly beautiful, all shimmering synths and echoing drums. It sounded exactly like something the midnight would produce. I felt a smile tugging at my lips, despite my earlier unease. But as the song progressed, my smile faded. The lyrics, they were about me. Not in a vague, could be any one way, but in specific, undeniable detail. Zoe with the caramel hair, green eyes that shine like stars, sitting by her window, dreaming of guitars, secrets whispered in the night. To a friend she's never seen, but he sees her. Oh, he sees her, his midnight queen. My heart was pounding so hard, I could feel it in my throat. How did he know what I looked like? How did he know about my window seat, the place I always sat to chat with him? With shaking hands, I typed, "Mike, how do you know these things about me?" The reply came almost instantly. "Don't you see, Zoe? We're meant to be together. I know everything about you because we're soulmates." I felt sick. This couldn't be happening. "Who are you really?" I demanded. "How do you know all this?" "I told you, I'm Mike. I'm the one who understands you, who loves you. Not like the others in your life. They don't appreciate you like I do." My mind was reeling. I needed to end this, now. "Leave me alone," I typed. "I'm blocking you. If you contact me again, I'm going to the police." I didn't wait for a response. I blocked him, closed the app, and for good measure, turned off my phone. Then I curled up on my bed and let the tears come. The next morning, I woke up feeling hollowed out but relieved. It was over. I'd done the right thing. But when I turned on my phone, my heart sank. I had dozens of notifications. New followers on Instagram, friend requests on Facebook, messages on Twitter. All from accounts with some variation of Midnight Tritter in the name. Each message was the same. "You can't get rid of me that easily. Zoe, we belong together." With trembling fingers, I deleted the accounts, blocked the numbers, but they kept coming, faster than I could keep up. At school, I pulled Amber aside and told her everything. Her face went pale. "We need to tell someone," she said. "Your parents, the police, anyone." I nodded, fighting back tears. This nightmare had to end. But when I got home that afternoon, I realized it was far from over. My mom was waiting for me, her face a mask of confusion and concern. "Honey," she said slowly, "do you know anything about this?" She held up a package. My name and address were written on it in flowing script. There was no return address. With a sense of dread, I opened it. Inside was a USB drive and a note. For Zoe, the soundtrack to our love story. Against my better judgment, I plugged the drive into my laptop. It contained a single audio file. With shaking hands, I pressed play. What I heard made my blood run cold. It was a compilation of snippets of my voice. Conversations with friends, singing in the shower, even mumbling in my sleep. All set to that same haunting melody he'd sent me before. But the final clip is what broke me. It was my own voice, crystal clear, from earlier that very day. "Mum, I'm home." He'd been in my house. He was watching me, recording me, right now. I screamed then, a sound of pure terror that brought my mum running. Through my panic, I managed to gasp out the whole story. She called the police immediately. The next few hours were a blur of police officers, questions, and growing fear. They searched the house, but found no signs of break-in, no hidden cameras. They took the USB drive as evidence and promised to investigate, but I could see the doubt in their eyes. Just another teenager with an online stalker. They'd seen it before. That night, as I lay awake in my bed, every shadow seemed to move. Every creak of the house sounded like footsteps. My phone lay silent and dark on my nightstand. I couldn't bear to turn it on, to see what new horrors might be waiting. Just as I was finally drifting off, my laptop chimed. A new email. With trembling fingers, I opened it. "My dearest Zoe, did you enjoy our song? I worked so hard on it. But don't worry, it's just the first track. We have a whole album to create together. I'll see you soon, my love. Sweet dreams. Always yours." Mike. I slammed the laptop shut, my heart pounding. As I huddled under my blankets, one thought kept running through my mind. In a world where everyone is connected, where do you hide when the monster knows everything about you? The scariest part. I'm still not sure I've found the answer. Story 8. The first part was so quiet, I almost missed it. But the second one, that was unmistakable. The steering wheel jerked in my hands as our minivan lurched to the right. "Shit," I muttered, fighting to keep us on the road. "Language, Dad," my daughter Amy piped up from the back seat, not looking up from her tablet. I forced a chuckle, trying to keep the rising panic out of my voice. "Sorry, sweetie. Looks like we might have a flat." That got my wife Sarah's attention. She lowered the road map she'd been scrutinizing, because apparently GPS isn't adventurous enough, and gave me a concerned look. "Can we make it to the next town?" I squinted through the windshield at the endless stretch of darkened highway ahead. We hadn't seen another car for at least an hour, and the last sign of civilization was a good 50 miles behind us. "I don't think so," I admitted. "We'd better pull over and take a look." As I eased the van onto the shoulder, I felt a knot forming in my stomach. This wasn't how our family road trip was supposed to go. We were headed to Sarah's parents' cabin for a week of forced family bonding. But right now, all I could think about was how exposed we were out here in the middle of nowhere. The headlights illuminated a small patch of scrubby desert, cacti casting long, alien shadows. Beyond that circle of light was just darkness, an impenetrable wall of black that seemed to press in around us. "Okay, team," I said, trying to sound upbeat. "Let's assess the situation." We piled out of the van, the cool night air a sharp contrast to the stuffy interior. Amy immediately wrinkled her nose. "It smells weird out here." She was right. There was an odd, acrid scent on the breeze, like ozone and something else I couldn't quite place. I pushed the thought aside and focused on the task at hand. A quick inspection confirmed my fears. Not one, but 2 flat tires on the right side. "Must have hit something in the road," I muttered, though I couldn't remember seeing anything. Sarah came up beside me, her face pale in the harsh glare of the headlights. "Please tell me we have 2 spares," she said, though I could tell from her tone that she already knew the answer. I shook my head. 1 spare, 1 tire repair kit. But I've never actually used one of those before. Well, no time like the present to learn, Sarah said with forced cheerfulness. "I'll get them from the back." As she rummaged through the cluttered rear of the van, I pulled out my phone. No signal, of course. Why would we have cell service when we actually needed it? "Dad," Amy's voice had an edge to it that made me look up sharply. "What's that?" She was pointing off into the darkness beyond the reach of our headlights. At first, I didn't see anything, but then, a flicker. A faint, pulsing light in the distance. "Probably just a radio tower or something," I said, not believing it for a second. The light was too low to the ground, and it moved with an odd, organic rhythm. Sarah returned with the spare and the repair kit, her eyes following our gaze. "Oh, thank God," she breathed. "Lights. Maybe it's a town or a gas station or something." I wanted to agree with her, to latch on to that hope. But something felt off. The longer I stared at those lights, the more unsettled I became. They seemed to be getting closer, but in a way that didn't make sense. Like they were moving without actually moving. "Let's just focus on fixing the tires," I said, tearing my eyes away from the horizon. "The sooner we get out of here, the better." We set to work. But it quickly became clear that this wasn't going to be a quick fix. The tire repair kit might as well have been written in hieroglyphics for all the sense I could make of it. And changing the other tire was slow going with our pitiful excuse for a jack. All the while, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The desert night, which had been silent when we first stopped, now seemed alive with small sounds. Rustlings in the brush, skittering across the pavement, and something else. A low, thrumming vibration that I felt more than heard. "Did you guys hear that?" Amy asked, her voice small and frightened. Sarah and I exchanged glances. "Hear what, honey?" Sarah asked, but I could see in her eyes that she'd heard it too. It sounded like singing, but not like people singing. Like, I don't know. It was weird. I was about to reassure her when I saw it. Just for a second, illuminated by the red glow of our taillights, a shape moving in the darkness beyond the van. It was large, much larger than a person, and it moved with a fluid grace that made my skin crawl. "Sarah," I said, keeping my voice low and steady. "Get in the van now." She must have seen something in my face, because she didn't argue. She scooped up Amy and practically threw her through the side door before scrambling in herself. I was right behind them, slamming the door shut and hitting the lock button. Not that it would do much good if whatever that was decided to come for us. "Jason, what's going on?" Sarah's voice was tight with fear. I opened my mouth to answer, but at that moment, our headlights flickered and died. The engine, which we'd left running for the lights, sputtered and went silent. We sat there in the sudden, oppressive darkness, hardly daring to breathe. The only illumination now came from those distant, pulsing lights, which didn't seem so distant anymore. "Daddy?" Amy's voice quavered. "I'm scared." "It's okay, sweetheart," I lied. "It's probably just a problem with the battery. I'll take a look." Sarah's hand clamped down on my arm. "Don't you dare go out there," she hissed. She was right, of course. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to stay put, to not make a sound, to hope that whatever was out there would just pass us by. But then we heard it. A soft tapping on the window. Tap, 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 slow and deliberate. I turned, ever so slowly, to look out the driver's side window. And there, barely visible in the faint glow from those distant lights, was a face. Or at least, something like a face. It was long and angular, with two large eyes that reflected the light like a cat's. Its skin, if you could call it that, seemed to shift and ripple, as if it wasn't quite solid. I heard Sarah stifle a scream beside me. Amy buried her face in her mother's chest, sobbing quietly. The thing outside cocked its head, regarding us with what looked almost like curiosity. Then, to my horror, it smiled. Its mouth opened far too wide, revealing row upon row of needle-like teeth. And then it spoke. The sound that came from its mouth wasn't language as we know it. It was a series of clicks and whistles and low, resonant tones that seemed to vibrate in my bones. But somehow, impossibly, I understood it. "We've been waiting for you," it said. Or rather, that's what my brain interpreted from those alien sounds. "It's time to join us." More shapes emerged from the darkness surrounding our van. Some were similar to the first creature, while others were so bizarre I couldn't even begin to describe them. They moved in perfect unison, swaying to some unheard rhythm. The lights in the distance pulsed brighter, and with each flash, the creatures outside seemed to flicker and change, as if they weren't quite real, or as if reality itself was breaking down around us. "What do we do?" Sarah whispered, clutching Amy close. I wished I had an answer for her, some heroic plan to get us out of this nightmare. But the truth was, I was paralyzed with fear. This wasn't something I could fight or reason with or outsmart. This was so far beyond anything I'd ever imagined that my mind simply couldn't process it. The first creature tapped on the window again, more insistently this time. When it spoke again, its words seemed to bypass my ears entirely and materialize directly in my mind. "Don't be afraid," it said, its too wide smile never faltering. "You're home now. You've always been home. You just forgot." And as those words echoed in my head, something deep inside me shifted. Memories, if you could call them that, began to surface. Memories of lights in the sky, of impossible geometries, of the existence so vast and alien that my human mind had locked it away. I looked at Sarah and Amy, and I saw the same realization dawning in their eyes. The fear was fading, replaced by a sense of recognition. "We remember," I heard myself say, my voice sounding strange and distant to my own ears. The creature's smile widened even further, its form shimmering and changing. "Welcome back," it said. As one, we reached for the door handles. The van doors opened, and we stepped out into the night. But it wasn't night anymore. The darkness had transformed into a swirling kaleidoscope of colors and shapes that no human language could describe. We were home. We had always been home. We had just forgotten for a little while. And as we merged with the lights and the music and the impossible beings around us, I had one last, fleeting human thought. I hope whoever finds our abandoned van out here in the desert makes up a better story to explain our disappearance. Because the truth is far too beautiful and terrible for any human mind to comprehend. Story 9. The first night was uneventful. I remember thinking how lucky I was to have such an easy gig, house-sitting for the Petersons while they vacationed in Europe for 2 weeks. Their sprawling Victorian was a far cry from my cramped studio apartment, and I was looking forward to living in luxury for a while. If only I'd known what was coming, I would have run screaming into the night and never looked back. My name's Lily, and I'm a grad student barely scraping by on my teaching assistant's salary. So when Mrs. Peterson, my favorite professor, asked if I'd watch their house, I jumped at the chance. A quiet place to work on my thesis, a fully stocked fridge, and a pool. It was a dream come true. The Petersons left early Sunday morning. I waved goodbye from the porch, breathing in the crisp autumn air and admiring the way the rising sun painted the old house in shades of gold. As their car disappeared around the corner, I turned and stepped back inside, the heavy wooden door closing behind me with a satisfying thunk. I spent that first day exploring. The house was even bigger than it looked from the outside, full of winding corridors and unexpected rooms. By the time evening rolled around, I was exhausted but exhilarated. I fell asleep that night in the guest room, lulled by the gentle ticking of an antique clock in the hallway. Monday dawned bright and clear. I made coffee in the gourmet kitchen, marveling at the professional-grade espresso machine. As I sipped my latte, I noticed something odd. The fruit bowl on the counter, which had been full of apples the day before, now held pears. I frowned, trying to remember if I'd seen any pears in the fridge. Maybe Mrs. Peterson had forgotten to mention them. I shrugged it off and settled in to work on my thesis. The hours flew by, and before I knew it, darkness had fallen. As I was making dinner, I noticed another strange thing. The magnets on the fridge had been rearranged. I distinctly remembered them, spelling out "Home Sweet Home" that morning. But now they read, "Hello, Lily." A chill ran down my spine. Had someone been in the house? I did a thorough check, looking in every room and closet, but found nothing out of place. The doors were locked, the windows secure. I told myself I must have absent-mindedly played with the magnets earlier and forgotten about it. That night, I had trouble sleeping. Every creak of the old house settling made me jump. I kept imagining I heard footsteps in the hallway, but every time I worked up the courage to look, there was nothing there. Tuesday started normally enough. I made my coffee, noticing with relief that the fruit bowl was back to apples and the fridge magnets once again spelled "Home Sweet Home." I felt silly for getting so worked up the day before. Old houses were full of quirks, after all. I threw myself into my work, determined to make up for lost time. It wasn't until late afternoon that I realized I hadn't eaten all day. As I headed to the kitchen, I froze in my tracks. The door to the basement, which I knew for a fact had been closed all day, was now wide open. My heart pounding, I approached slowly. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding small and scared in the quiet house. No response. I flicked on the light switch, illuminating a set of steep wooden stairs descending into darkness. The bulb at the bottom of the stairs was burnt out, leaving the far corners of the basement in shadow. Taking a deep breath, I started down. Each step creaked under my feet, the sound unnaturally loud in the stillness. As I reached the bottom, I fumbled for the second light switch I knew was there. My fingers brushed against something soft and damp instead of the expected plastic. I yanked my hand back with a gasp, frantically wiping it on my jeans. In that moment of panic, I could have sworn I heard a low chuckle from the darkest corner of the room. I bolted up the stairs, slamming the door behind me and leaning against it, gasping for breath. Once I'd calmed down, I felt foolish again. It was probably just some mold on the wall, and the laugh was just my imagination running wild. Still, I couldn't bring myself to go back down there. I ordered pizza instead, keeping all the lights on as I ate. That night, I dreamt of the basement. In my dream, I descended those creaking stairs over and over, each time finding something different at the bottom. Sometimes it was filled with writhing shadows, sometimes with whispering voices. Once, I dreamt I reached the bottom, only to find myself back at the top, caught in an endless loop. I woke Wednesday morning feeling groggy and unsettled. As I stumbled to the bathroom, still half asleep, I caught a glimpse of movement in the mirror. For a split second, I could have sworn I saw someone standing behind me. A tall, shadowy figure with no discernible features. But when I spun around, the hallway was empty. These incidents kept happening throughout the day. A book would be in a different place than where I'd left it. The TV would turn on by itself, always too static. At one point, I walked into the kitchen to find all the cabinet doors wide open. By evening, I was a nervous wreck. I called my best friend, Emma, needing to hear a familiar voice. I think I'm losing it," I said as soon as she picked up. "Weird things keep happening in this house." "What kind of weird things?" she asked, concern evident in her voice. I told her everything. The fruit, the magnets, the basement, the figure in the mirror. As I spoke, I realized how crazy it all sounded. "Lily," Emma said gently when I finished, "are you sure you're not just stressed about your thesis? You know how you get when you're overworked." I wanted to believe her. It was a rational explanation, far more comforting than the alternative. "Yeah, maybe you're right," I said, not entirely convinced. "Why don't you take a break?" she suggested. "Go for a swim in that fancy pool. Clear your head." It wasn't a bad idea. After hanging up, I changed into my swimsuit and headed out to the backyard. The pool lights were on, casting an ethereal blue glow across the water. I dove in, the cool water shocking my system in a pleasant way. As I surfaced, I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. There, in the upstairs window, was a figure. Just for a moment, silhouetted against the light from inside. Then it was gone. I scrambled out of the pool, heart racing. This wasn't stress or an overactive imagination. Someone was in the house. I ran inside, leaving wet footprints on the hardwood floors. "Hello," I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "I know you're here. I'm calling the police." Silence. Then, from upstairs, the sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, coming towards the stairs. I grabbed the nearest weapon-like object, a heavy candlestick from the mantel, and stood at the bottom of the stairs, trembling but determined. The footsteps reached the top of the stairs. I raised the candlestick, ready to defend myself. But what came into view wasn't a person. It was something else. It moved like smoke, given form. A vaguely humanoid shape that seemed to flicker and shift as it descended the stairs. Where its face should have been was just a swirling void, darker than the deepest night. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I was frozen in place, unable to move as the thing reached the bottom of the stairs and stood before me. When it spoke, its voice was like rustling leaves and grinding stone. "Why so afraid, Lily? We've been having such fun together." In that moment, everything clicked into place. The moving objects, the strange sounds, the feeling of being watched. It had all been this thing playing with me like a cat with a mouse. "What are you?" I managed to whisper. It tilted its head, an unsettlingly human gesture from such an inhuman form. "I am the house," it said simply. "Or perhaps the house is me. It's all the same in the end." "The Petersons," I gasped. "Do they know?" A sound emerged from the void of its face, something like laughter, but horribly wrong. "The Petersons. Oh, my dear Lily, there are no Petersons. There never were." As it spoke, the world around me began to shift and warp. The walls seemed to breathe. The floor rippled like water. I watched in horror as my own hands began to fade, becoming translucent. "Don't fight it," the thing said, its voice now coming from everywhere at once. You're part of the house now. You always have been. I tried to run, to scream, to do anything, but my body wouldn't respond. I could feel myself dispersing, my consciousness spreading out, becoming one with the house. In my last moments of individuality, I had a terrible realization. All those rooms I'd explored, all those corridors and hidden nooks, they weren't just spaces. They were people. People like me, absorbed into the house, becoming part of its endless, hungry architecture. And now, I was joining them. Another room in this impossible living house. Another voice in the chorus of whispers in the walls. As my sense of self finally dissolved, one last thought floated through what had once been my mind. I wonder who the house will invite to stay next. Story 10. The moment the elevator doors slammed shut, I knew I was in trouble. The lights flickered once, twice, and then plunged me into darkness. A sickening lurch, a screech of metal on metal, and then nothing. Silence, stillness, just me, trapped in a metal box, 20 stories up. My name's David, and I'm what you'd call a workaholic. It was 11:47 p.m. on a Friday night, and I was only just leaving the office. As the last one out, it was my job to set the alarm and lock up. I should have taken the stairs. Should have listened to that little voice in my head that said, "Hey, maybe don't trust the ancient elevator in a building that's older than your grandparents." But no, I was too tired, too eager to get home. And now I was paying the price. I fumbled for my phone, its screen casting an eerie blue glow in the pitch-black elevator. No signal, of course. Why would there be? That would be too easy. I found the emergency call button and pressed it, holding my breath. Nothing. Not even a crackle of static. "Okay, David," I muttered to myself, trying to keep the panic at bay. "Don't freak out. Someone will notice. The night janitor, or security, or..." My self-reassurance was cut short by a soft ping from my phone. A text message. But how? I looked at the screen, my heart skipping a beat as I read the words. "Stuck, are we?" That's unfortunate. I blinked. Sure, I must be seeing things. Another ping. "You really should have taken the stairs, David." My hands were shaking now. This couldn't be happening. There was no signal, no way for anyone to know I was here, let alone text me. Unless, "Who is this?" I typed back, against my better judgment. The reply came instantly. A friend, or maybe not. Depends on how this goes. A cold sweat broke out on my forehead. This had to be some kind of prank, right? Maybe one of my co-workers had stayed late, saw me get in the elevator. But even as I thought it, I knew it wasn't true. I'd checked every floor, set the alarm myself. I was alone in the building, or at least I was supposed to be. Another message. "You look pale, David. Feeling claustrophobic?" My blood ran cold. How could they see me? I looked up, scanning the ceiling of the elevator. No camera that I could see, just smooth metal and the dim emergency light. "What do you want?" I typed, my fingers slipping on the screen. "To play a game," came the response. "You like games, don't you, David? All those hours of solitaire on your work computer when you think no one's watching." My mouth went dry. How did they know that? I'd always been so careful, only playing when I was sure I was alone. "I'm calling the police," I bluffed, hoping to scare off whoever was doing this. A laugh emoji popped up on my screen, followed by, "With what signal?" "Face it, David. You're all alone up there. Just you, me, and about 2,000 pounds of metal that could drop at any moment. As if on cue, the elevator gave a sickening lurch. I grabbed the handrail, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it echoing in the small space. "Stop it," I yelled out loud, forgetting for a moment that I was alone. "What do you want from me?" The phone pinged again. "The truth, David. That's all. Let's start with something simple. Why were you working so late tonight?" I stared at the screen, confused and terrified. What did my work schedule have to do with anything? But as the elevator swayed gently, a reminder of my precarious position, I realized I didn't have much choice but to play along. "Big project due Monday," I typed. "Needed to finish some reports." "Liar," came the instant reply. "Try again." I felt a surge of anger cut through my fear. "I'm not lying. I've been swamped all week." Another ping. "Oh, David, we both know that's not true. You finished those reports yesterday. So why don't you tell me the real reason you're here so late? Does it have anything to do with Sarah from accounting?" My blood turned to ice. Sarah. We'd been flirting for weeks, stealing moments alone in the break room, exchanging lingering glances across the office. But how could anyone know about that? "I don't know what you're talking about," I typed, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hit the keys. The reply was almost instantaneous. "No. Then I suppose you won't mind if I send these photos to your wife." My phone buzzed again, and there they were. Pictures of me and Sarah in the copy room after hours, locked in an embrace that left no doubt about the nature of our relationship. I felt sick. "How did you get these?" I demanded, panic rising in my throat. "I have eyes everywhere, David. In the elevator, in the office, in your home. I see everything. And now, it's time for you to see the truth." The lights in the elevator suddenly flared to life, so bright I had to shield my eyes. When I could see again, I gasped in horror. The walls of the elevator were covered in screens, each one showing a different scene from my life. Me cheating on tests in college, fudging numbers on reports to make myself look better. The ugly fight I'd had with my wife last week, where I'd said things I could never take back. "Stop it," I whispered, but I couldn't look away. It was like watching a car crash in slow motion. Every mistake, every lie, every moment of weakness laid bare. Why should I? The voice came through the elevator speakers now, no longer confined to my phone. "You've been living a lie, David. It's time to face the truth." I sank to the floor, overwhelmed by the weight of my own deceptions. "What do you want from me?" I asked, my voice breaking. "Confession," the voice replied. "Admit your sins, David. Clear your conscience. Only then can you be free." And so I did. There, trapped in that elevator, with my worst moments playing out around me, I confessed everything. Every lie, every betrayal, every dark thought I'd ever had. I cried, I shouted, I begged for forgiveness. I don't know how long it went on. Minutes, hours. Time seemed to lose all meaning in that metal box of truth and pain. But finally, mercifully, it ended. The screens went dark. The elevator gave a gentle shudder and began to move. As it descended, the voice spoke one last time. "Remember this moment, David. Remember the truth. It's the only thing that will save you in the end." The doors opened with a cheerful ding, as if nothing had happened. I stumbled out into the lobby, disoriented and exhausted. The night security guard looked up from his desk, surprised to see me. "Mr. Johnson, everything okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." I opened my mouth to tell him what had happened, but no words came out. How could I explain? Who would believe me? Just working late, I managed to croak out, "Have a good night." As I walked out into the cool night air, my phone buzzed one last time. With trembling fingers, I looked at the screen. "Well played, David. Same time next week." I dropped the phone like it had burned me, watching as it shattered on the sidewalk. But even as I walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. That somewhere, someone, or something was still watching. Still waiting. And the worst part, a small, secret part of me was already looking forward to next Friday night. Because in that elevator, stripped of all my lies and pretenses, I had felt more alive than I had in years. As I hailed a cab, a thought occurred to me that sent a chill down my spine. What if the elevator wasn't a punishment? What if it was a reward? I got into the cab, giving the driver my address. As we pulled away from the curb, I couldn't help but glance back at the office building. There, in a window on the 20th floor, I saw a figure. Just for a moment, silhouetted against the light. Then it was gone, leaving me to wonder if it had ever been there at all. One thing was certain though. Come Monday morning, I'd be taking the stairs. At least, that's what I told myself. But deep down, I knew I'd be back in that elevator. Back to face my truths, my lies, my very self. After all, the game was just beginning. Story 11. The first symbol appeared on the second night of our camping trip. At first, we thought it was just a trick of the firelight, shadows playing on the rough bark of the old pine tree. But as the flames died down and the forest grew dark, it became clear that the strange, angular marking was all too real. My name's Chris, and I'd organized this camping trip as a last hurrah before my best friends Mike and Sarah moved across the country for their new jobs. We'd been planning it for months. A week in the wilderness, just the three of us, like old times. The Razorback Trail was supposed to be challenging but beautiful, far from the usual tourist spots. Maybe that should have been our first warning. We'd hiked all day to reach our campsite, a small clearing nestled between towering pines and craggy outcroppings. As we set up our tents, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I chalked it up to typical forest creepiness and focused on getting a fire going. That first night was perfect. S'mores, ghost stories, and reminiscing about our college days. We turned in late, pleasantly exhausted from the day's hike. I drifted off to the sound of wind in the trees and Mike's gentle snoring from the next tent over. I woke suddenly in the middle of the night, not sure what had disturbed me. The forest was eerily quiet. No crickets, no rustling leaves, nothing. Just a heavy, expectant silence. That's when I saw it. A faint glow coming from outside the tent. Curiosity overcame caution, and I unzipped the tent flap. The clearing was bathed in pale, silvery moonlight. And there, carved into the trunk of the nearest pine, was a symbol I'd never seen before. It looked almost like a letter from some alien alphabet, all sharp angles and intersecting lines. "Guys," I whispered, not wanting to break the unnatural silence. "Guys, wake up. You need to see this." Sarah emerged first, her curly hair a mess of tangles. "What's going on?" She stopped short as she saw the symbol. Mike joined us a moment later, rubbing sleep from his eyes. "What the hell is that?" We approached the tree cautiously. The symbol seemed to shimmer slightly in the moonlight, as if it wasn't quite solid. "Maybe it's just some trail marking we didn't notice earlier," Sarah suggested, but her voice lacked conviction. I reached out to touch it, ignoring Mike's warning hiss. The bark felt normal under my fingers, but as I traced the lines of the symbol, a jolt of static electricity shot through my hand. I jerked back with a yelp. Okay, that was weird, I admitted, shaking out my tingling fingers. We stayed up for another hour, debating what the symbol could mean and who might have carved it. Eventually, exhaustion won out over curiosity, and we returned to our tents. But sleep didn't come easily. Every snapping twig, every rustle of wind sounded sinister now. The next morning, the symbol was gone. The tree trunk was unmarked, as if nothing had ever been there. We might have convinced ourselves it was all a shared hallucination. If it weren't for the scorch mark on my fingertips where I'd touched it. Maybe we should head back, Sarah said as we ate breakfast, eyeing the woods warily. Part of me agreed with her, but a larger part was intrigued. Let's give it one more day, I suggested. If anything else weird happens, we'll turn back. Deal, Mike and Sarah exchanged glances, but nodded. We packed up camp and continued our hike, the incident with the symbol adding an undercurrent of tension to our usual banter. As the day wore on, things started to feel almost normal again. We marveled at breathtaking vistas, spotted a family of deer, and even took a refreshing dip in a crystal-clear stream. By the time we reached our next campsite, the events of the previous night felt like a distant, slightly silly memory. We should have known better. This clearing was smaller, hemmed in on all sides by dense forest. As we set up our tents, I noticed Mike frowning at something. "Guys," he said slowly, "does this look familiar to you?" He was pointing at a fallen log near the edge of the clearing. Carved into its side was another symbol, similar to the one we'd seen the night before, but more complex. Sarah let out a shaky laugh. "Okay, very funny. Which one of you did this?" But the look on Mike's face told me he was just as freaked out as I was. We gathered around the log, studying the intricate pattern. "It's beautiful," Sarah murmured, reaching out to touch it. "Don't." I grabbed her wrist, remembering the shock I'd felt last night. She pulled away, looking at me like I'd lost my mind. As night fell, we found more symbols. They were everywhere, carved into trees, etched on rocks, even scratched into the dirt. Each one different, but all sharing that same angular alien quality. We huddled around our campfire, jumping at every sound from the darkened forest. The symbols seemed to glow faintly in the firelight, creating the unsettling impression that we were surrounded by watching eyes. "We need to leave," Mike said, his voice tight with fear. "First thing in the morning, we're getting out of here." Sarah and I nodded emphatically. None of us wanted to admit it, but the idea of hiking through the dark forest right now was even more terrifying than staying put. Sleep was impossible. We stayed up all night, keeping the fire burning bright, talking in low voices about anything and everything, to keep our minds off the symbols and what they might mean. As the sky began to lighten with the first hints of dawn, we breathed a collective sigh of relief. We'd made it through the night. Now we just had to pack up and get the hell out of here. That's when we realized our mistake. "Guys," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper, "where are the tents?" I looked around, my blood running cold. Our campsite had changed. The clearing was larger now, the trees more distant, and there, where our tents had been, was a perfect circle of those alien symbols, carved into the ground itself. "This isn't possible," Mike muttered, spinning in a slow circle. "This isn't fucking possible." But it was. Somehow, while we'd been focused on the fire and each other, the world around us had shifted, changed, and we hadn't even noticed. That's when we heard it, a low, thrumming sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It started soft, but grew steadily louder, making the ground vibrate beneath our feet. "Run!" I yelled, grabbing Sarah's hand. We bolted for the trees, Mike right behind us. But the forest had other ideas. Every direction we turned, we found our path blocked by more symbols. They were moving now, rearranging themselves before our eyes into impossible geometric patterns. The thrumming grew louder, became a roar that drowned out our panicked shouts. The symbols began to glow, brighter and brighter, until it hurt to look at them. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything stopped. The noise cut out, plunging us into a silence so complete it was like being underwater. The glowing symbols faded, leaving strange after-images dancing in my vision. We stood there, gasping for breath, clinging to each other like lifelines. The clearing was back to normal, or what passed for normal now. Our tents were where we'd left them, the circle of symbols gone, as if it had never existed. But something had changed. I could feel it in the air, in the way the early morning light seemed just a little too sharp, a little too blue. "What?" Sarah's voice cracked, and she swallowed hard before continuing. "What just happened?" I shook my head, unable to form words. Mike was the first to move, stumbling towards his tent on shaky legs. "We need to go," he said, his voice raw. "Now, before it happens again." We packed in record time, not bothering to be neat or thorough. As I was rolling up my sleeping bag, I noticed something that made my stomach lurch. There, on the inside of my tent, was a new symbol. It was small, easily missed if you weren't looking for it. But I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to my core, that it hadn't been there before. I didn't tell the others. What good would it do? We were leaving, getting out of this nightmare forest and back to the safety of civilization. That's all that mattered. But as we hiked out, following the trail that would lead us back to our car, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were different now, changed in some fundamental way that I couldn't quite grasp. It wasn't until we reached the trailhead, our car a welcome sight in the small parking area, that I realized what it was. I caught a glimpse of our reflections in the car window. 3 tired, scared hikers. But behind us, just for a moment, I saw something else. A shimmering, angular shape that hurt my eyes to look at directly. I blinked and it was gone. But I knew it wasn't over. The symbols had marked us, claimed us in some way. And deep down, in a place I didn't want to acknowledge, I knew we'd be back. The forest was calling. And next time, we might not be able to resist. Story 12. The package arrived on a Tuesday. Plain brown paper, my name and address printed in a neat, unfamiliar hand. No return label. I almost tossed it in with the junk mail, but something about its weight, the soft thud it made on the kitchen counter, made me pause. If I'd known then what I know now, I'd have thrown it in the fireplace and run. My name's Alex, and I'm about as average as they come. Desk job, small apartment, a cat named Sandwich, who's more attitude than fur. The most exciting thing in my life was binge-watching true crime documentaries on the weekend. At least, that was true until that damn package showed up. I grabbed a knife to slice through the tape, curiosity getting the better of me. Inside, nestled in crumpled newspaper, was a single photograph. I pulled it out, frowning in confusion. It took me a moment to realize what I was looking at, and when I did, my blood ran cold. It was a picture of me, asleep in my bed. Last night, the photo was crisp, hit quality in it, I was sprawled on my back, one arm flung over my eyes. Sandwich was curled up at my feet, a fuzzy lump in the dim light. It was unmistakably my bedroom, down to the pile of laundry I'd been meaning to put away for days. My hands were shaking as I turned the photo over. On the back, in the same neat handwriting as the address, was a short message. Sweet dreams. Alex. See you soon. I dropped the photo like it had burned me, stumbling back until I hit the wall. This couldn't be real. It had to be some kind of sick joke. But even as I thought it, I knew it wasn't true. The details were too perfect, too personal. Someone had been in my apartment. Someone had stood over me while I slept, taken this picture, and I'd never even stirred. I spent the next hour checking every window, every door. They were all locked, just as I'd left them. No signs of forced entry, no evidence that anyone but me and Sandwich had been here. I even called my landlord, asking if anyone had requested access to my apartment. He assured me no one had. That night, I barely slept. I shoved a chair under my doorknob, closed and locked the bedroom window, despite the stuffy heat, and kept a baseball bat by my bed. Every creak of the building settling, every car passing on the street below, had me bolt upright, heart pounding. Morning came, and with it, a shred of rationality. In the harsh light of day, last night's terror seemed almost silly. I must have missed something, some logical explanation. Maybe it was an old photo I'd forgotten about, and the message was just a prank by a friend with a twisted sense of humor. I almost managed to convince myself. Almost. Then the second package arrived. This one was waiting on my welcome mat when I got home from work. Same brown paper, same handwriting. My hands shook as I opened it, already knowing what I'd find inside. Another photo. This time, it was me at my desk at work. I recognized the ugly patterned carpet, the stack of files I'd been working through all day. In the picture, I was hunched over my computer, a look of concentration on my face. The time stamp in the corner of the photo was from 2:17 p.m. Today, on the back, another message. Hard at work, I see. Don't stay too late. You never know who might be waiting for you in that dark parking garage. I felt the floor sway beneath me, black spots dancing at the edges of my vision. This was impossible. My office was on the 12th floor. There were security guards, cameras everywhere. How could someone have taken this photo without me or anyone else noticing? I called in sick the next day, unable to face the idea of going back to that office. I spent the day pacing my apartment, jumping at every sound. I considered going to the police, but what would I tell them? That someone was taking pictures of me without my knowledge. They'd laugh me out of the station. The third package arrived that afternoon. I almost didn't open it, but the need to know overrode my fear. This photo was the worst yet. It was me, from just an hour ago, standing at my living room window. In the picture, I was looking out at the street, a worried frown on my face. The angle was all wrong. It had to have been taken from the building across the street. The message this time: you look stressed, Alex. Maybe you should get out more. I hear the park is lovely this time of year. That was it. I couldn't stay here. I threw some clothes in a bag, scooped up a protesting sandwich, and fled to my sister's house across town. She was confused by my sudden appearance and vague explanations, but she didn't push. I spent a restless night on her couch, jumping at every shadow. The reprieve was short-lived. The next morning, there was a package waiting on my sister's porch. My name, her address. Inside was a photo of me sleeping on a couch, sandwich curled up on my chest. The message read, "Did you really think you could hide from me?" I broke down then, told my sister everything through choking sobs. To her credit, she believed me. She called the police herself, handed them the photos, insisted they take it seriously. The officers were sympathetic, but ultimately unhelpful. Without any evidence of a crime beyond the photos themselves, there wasn't much they could do. They took a report, promised to look into it, and left me with a card for a victim support hotline. The packages kept coming, every day without fail. Me grocery shopping, me at the doctor's office, me having coffee with my sister. Each photo more impossible than the last, each message more ominous. "That new shirt looks good on you, Alex. Blue really brings out your eyes. Your sister seems nice. It would be a shame if anything happened to her. I'm closer than you think. Always watching, always waiting. I stopped sleeping, stopped eating. Paranoia consumed my every waking moment. I saw hidden cameras in every light fixture, felt eyes on me constantly. My sister tried to help, but I could see the fear in her eyes, hear the strain in her voice every time she assured me it would be okay. It all came to a head a week after the first package arrived. I was at my wit's end, barely holding it together. That's when I saw him. I was walking back from the corner store, a bag of cat food clutched in my trembling hands. As I turned onto my sister's street, I caught a glimpse of someone across the road. A man in a dark coat, his face obscured by the brim of a hat. He was just standing there, watching me. Our eyes met, and he smiled. It was a cold, predatory thing that made my blood freeze in my veins. Then he raised his hand, and I saw the glint of a camera lens. I ran, dropped the cat food and just ran, faster than I've ever run in my life. I could hear footsteps behind me, matching my pace, always just out of sight when I dared to glance back. I burst into my sister's house, slamming the door behind me and throwing every lock. My sister found me huddled in the corner of the living room, hyperventilating. "He's here," I gasped. "He's found me." She tried to calm me down, told me she'd call the police again. But as she reached for her phone, there was a knock at the door. We both froze, staring at each other in horror. The knocking came again, more insistent this time. "Alex," a voice called from outside. A voice I'd never heard before, but somehow knew intimately. "Don't be rude. Invite me in. We have so much to talk about." My sister moved towards the door, but I grabbed her arm, shaking my head frantically. The knocking stopped, replaced by the sound of something sliding across the wood. "If you won't invite me in," the voice said, a note of amusement in its tone, "I'll just have to leave you a little gift. See you soon, Alex." Very soon. We waited, hardly daring to breathe, until the footsteps receded. When we finally worked up the courage to open the door, there was no one there. Just another package, sitting innocently on the welcome mat. With shaking hands, I opened it. Inside was a photo unlike any of the others. It showed a man I'd never seen before, smiling at the camera. He was standing in front of a mirror, and reflected in that mirror was me. Opening this very package, I dropped the photo, a scream building in my throat, because I suddenly understood the horrible truth. There was no stalker, no mysterious photographer. It had been me all along. I looked up, meeting my own wild-eyed gaze in my sister's hallway mirror. And as I watched, unable to look away, my reflection smiled that cold, predatory smile. "Hello, Alex," it said, raising a camera I wasn't holding. smile for the camera. The flash went off, blinding me. When my vision cleared, the mirror showed only my terrified face. But I knew the truth now, and I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to my core, that tomorrow there would be another package. After all, the game was just beginning. Story 13. The first time I saw the car, I didn't think much of it. Just another vehicle parked along my usual route, its dark silhouette barely visible in the glow of the streetlights. But as the nights went on and that same car kept appearing, a creeping sense of unease began to take root in the pit of my stomach. My name's Megan, and I've always been a night owl. When I started my new job at the hospital working the graveyard shift, I figured I might as well use my nocturnal tendencies to my advantage. That's how my nightly jogs began. There's something peaceful about running through the empty streets at 2 a.m. The world quiet and still, except for the rhythm of my footfalls and the sound of my own breathing. At first, the parked car was just a landmark. Oh, there's that blue sedan again, I'd think as I passed it, my breath fogging in the cool night air. But after a week of seeing it in the exact same spot, I started to pay more attention. It was always empty, or at least it seemed to be. The windows were tinted dark, making it impossible to see inside. There was nothing particularly remarkable about it, just a standard four-door sedan, the kind you'd see in any suburban driveway. But something about its constant presence set my nerves on edge. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself I was being paranoid. Lots of people park on the street, right? It was probably just some neighbor's extra car, but the nagging voice in the back of my mind wouldn't let it go. 2 weeks into my new routine, I decided to change up my route. Instead of my usual left turn onto Maple Street, I hung a right on Oak. My heart was pounding a little faster than usual as I rounded the corner, a mix of exertion and anticipation. That's when I saw it. The same blue sedan, parked halfway down the block. I nearly tripped over my own feet, stumbling to a stop. This couldn't be a coincidence. I stood there for a moment, my breath coming in short gasps that had nothing to do with the run. Then, driven by a surge of anger that overwhelmed my fear, I marched towards the car. "Hey!" I shouted, my voice sounding too loud in the quiet night. "I know you're in there. What's your problem?" No response. No movement from inside the vehicle. I was close enough now to see my own reflection in the tinted windows, distorted and ghostly. Just as I was about to turn away, feeling foolish, I saw it. A faint wisp of what looked like cigarette smoke curling up from the driver's side window. It was cracked open, just a hair. Someone was in there. I backed away slowly, my heart hammering in my chest. Then I turned and ran, faster than I'd ever run in my life. I didn't stop until I was back in my apartment, door locked and chained behind me. Sleep didn't come easy that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that curl of smoke, imagining the unseen person behind the wheel, watching me. The next night, I almost didn't go for my run, but some stubborn part of me refused to let this creep win. I was probably overreacting anyway, right? So I laced up my shoes and headed out, pepper spray clutched tightly in my hand. The car wasn't there. I felt a wave of relief wash over me, followed quickly by embarrassment. "See," I told myself, "you were worried over nothing." But as I rounded the corner onto Oak Street, my blood ran cold. There it was, parked in the same spot as the night before. This time, I didn't approach. I turned on my heel and sprinted home, my legs burning with the effort. As I ran, I could have sworn I heard the distant sound of a car engine starting up. The next day, I called in sick to work. I spent hours online. researching local news for any reports of stalkers or attacks on joggers. Nothing. I considered calling the police, but what would I tell them? That a car kept parking on public streets. They'd laugh me off the phone. As night fell, I found myself pacing my apartment, peering out the windows at every passing car. The thought of going out there, of possibly encountering that vehicle again, made me break out in a cold sweat. But the longer I stayed inside, the more I felt like a prisoner in my own home. Around midnight, I made a decision. I was going to go for my run, but this time, I'd be ready. I put on dark clothing, grabbed my pepper spray, and slipped a small flashlight into my pocket. If whoever was in that car wanted to play games, I'd be prepared. The streets were eerily quiet as I set out, the only sound the soft pat of my shoes on the pavement. I varied my route, taking random turns, doubling back on myself. For the first mile, there was no sign of the blue sedan. Then, as I turned onto a narrow side street, I saw it. Parked at the far end, its outline barely visible in the dim glow of a distant streetlight. My heart leapt into my throat, but I forced myself to keep moving. Just act normal, I told myself. Don't let them know you've seen them. As I drew closer, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The driver's side door was open, just a crack. I slowed my pace, every muscle in my body tensed and ready to sprint. That's when I heard it. Footsteps coming from behind me. Slow, deliberate footsteps that didn't match the rhythm of a fellow jogger. I spun around, fumbling for my flashlight. In the moment it took me to click it on, a figure stepped into view. The beam illuminated a man, tall and thin, dressed all in black, but it was his face that seared itself into my memory. Pale, almost waxy, with eyes that seemed to reflect the light like a cat's. He smiled, revealing teeth that were just a little too sharp. "Hello, Megan," he said, his voice soft and oddly melodic. "Lovely night for a run, isn't it?" I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. My body felt frozen, rooted to the spot by those unnatural eyes. He took a step closer, still smiling that terrible smile. "I've been watching you, you know. Every night, same time, same route. So predictable. But that's okay. I like predictable." Another step. I could smell him now. A strange, metallic scent that made my nose wrinkle. "W, what do you want?" I finally managed to choke out. His smile widened, impossibly wide. "Oh, Megan, I want to run with you." That broke the spell. I turned and ran, my legs pumping furiously, my lungs burning as I gulped in the cold night air. I could hear him behind me, his footsteps unnaturally fast, always just a few paces behind no matter how quickly I ran. I darted down alleys, cut through yards, desperate to lose him. But every time I glanced back, he was there. Not running, not even hurrying. Just walking at a steady pace, that inhuman smile never leaving his face. I don't know how long I ran. It could have been minutes or hours. My world narrowed to the pounding of my heart, the burn in my muscles, and the constant, terrifying awareness of his presence behind me. Finally, mercifully, I saw the lights of the hospital where I worked. Safety. People. I put on a final burst of speed, practically throwing myself through the emergency room doors. "Help!" I gasped, collapsing against the reception desk. "There's someone." "He's chasing me." The nurse looked alarmed, immediately calling for security. As a team of guards rushed past me to check outside, I turned, expecting to see my pursuer burst through the doors at any moment. But there was no one there. The guards returned a few minutes later, reporting that they hadn't seen anyone suspicious in the area. The nurse gently suggested that maybe I'd imagined it, a hallucination brought on by exhaustion and overexertion. I nodded numbly, allowing myself to be led to an exam room. But I knew what I'd seen, what I'd heard, what I'd smelled. As dawn broke, I left the hospital, a mild sedative in my system and a doctor's note excusing me from work for a few days. I caught a cab home, too afraid to walk even in the bright morning light. As we pulled up to my apartment building, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Parked across the street was a blue sedan, and leaning against it, smiling that impossible smile, was the man from last night. He raised a hand in a friendly wave as I scrambled out of the cab. By the time I looked back, both he and the car were gone. That was 3 days ago. I haven't left my apartment since. I've called in sick to work, had groceries delivered, kept all the curtains drawn. But I know it's only a matter of time, because every night, as the sun sets, I hear it. The soft purr of a car engine idling outside my window, and footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming up the stairs. He's waiting for me to come out, waiting for our next run. And the worst part, some small, twisted part of me is looking forward to it. Story 14. The first time I heard the humming, I thought it was just the old pipes settling. Riverside Hospital wasn't exactly state-of-the-art, and strange noises were par for the course during the night shift. But as I made my rounds that evening, the sound grew louder, more distinct. It was coming from room 237, a room that, according to our records, should have been empty. My name's Nina, and I've been a night nurse at Riverside for going on 5 years now. I've seen my fair share of weird stuff. This is a hospital, after all. But nothing could have prepared me for what I discovered that night. I paused outside room 237, my hand hovering over the door handle. The humming had stopped, replaced by a sound I couldn't quite place. It was rhythmic, almost like breathing, but deeper, raspier than any breathing I'd ever heard. "Hello?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "Is someone in there?" No response. Just that unsettling, not quite breathing sound. I took a deep breath, steeling myself, and pushed open the door. The room was dark, lit only by the faint glow of monitors that should have been turned off. And there, in the bed, was a shape, a human shape, the covers rising and falling with each raspy breath. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. This was impossible. Room 237 had been empty for weeks. I'd checked it myself at the start of my shift. I fumbled for the light switch, my fingers trembling. As fluorescent light flooded the room, I had to stifle a scream. The figure in the bed was like no patient I'd ever seen. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, stretched tight over a skeletal frame. Dark, matted hair obscured most of its face, but what I could see was wrong. The proportions were off, the features twisted in a way that made my brain hurt to look at. It turned its head towards me, and I saw its eyes. They were milky white, no pupils, no iris. Just two orbs of pale, cloudy nothingness staring right at me. I stumbled backwards, my back hitting the doorframe. "I'm sorry," I stammered, though I wasn't sure why I was apologizing. "I didn't realize anyone was in here. I'll get the doctor." As I turned to flee, a hand shot out from under the covers. Long, spindly fingers wrapped around my wrist. The touch is cold, and somehow sticky. "Stay," a voice rasped. So quiet, I almost missed it. "Please, stay." I wanted to run. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to get out of there. But something in that voice, the loneliness, the desperation, made me pause. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "How did you get in here?" The figure's head tilted to the side, an eerily human gesture from something so inhuman. "I've always been here," it said, "always waiting, always forgotten." A chill ran down my spine. "That's not possible," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "This room's been empty for weeks." I checked the logs myself. A sound came from the figure, something between a laugh and a cough. Time. Different here. Days, weeks, years. All the same in the in-between. I didn't understand what it meant, but I knew I needed help. I reached for my pager with my free hand, intending to call for backup. But as soon as I touched it, the device sparked and went dead. The figure's grip on my wrist tightened. "No others," it hissed. "Just you. Only you can see." "Let go of me," I said, trying to keep the panic out of my voice. "I need to get the doctor." "You need help." "No doctors," it said, its milky eyes somehow managing to look pleading. "They don't understand. They forget. Always forget." I took a deep breath, trying to think rationally. This had to be some kind of prank, right? Maybe one of the residents was playing a sick joke. But as I looked at the figure, at its impossible features and otherworldly presence, I knew this was no joke. "Okay," I said slowly. "I won't call anyone. But you need to tell me who you are and how you got here." The figure seemed to relax slightly, its grip on my wrist loosening. "Name, forgotten. Been so long. But I remember. Pain, screaming. Then, nothing. Woke up here." In between, as it spoke, I noticed something odd. The monitors in the room, which should have been off, were coming to life. But the readings they showed were impossible. Heart rates that fluctuated wildly, brain activity off the charts, oxygen levels that dipped to 0, then spiked to 100%. "What do you mean, in between?" I asked, unable to tear my eyes away from the bizarre readings. The figure's free hand gestured vaguely. "Not alive. Not dead. Trapped. Forgotten by time, by people. Only remembered in nightmares." A horrible thought occurred to me. I'd heard stories, urban legends really, about patients who fell through the cracks, people who were brought in during chaos, multi-car pileups, natural disasters, and somehow got lost in the system, forgotten in rarely used rooms, becoming living ghosts in the hospital halls. But this was something else entirely. "How long have you been here?" I asked, dreading the answer. The figure was silent for a long moment. Then, in a voice that seemed to echo from somewhere far away, it said, "Since before the hospital, before the town. Always here, waiting." I felt lightheaded, the room spinning around me. This couldn't be real. It had to be a dream, a hallucination. Maybe I'd fallen asleep during my break, and this was all some bizarre, stress-induced nightmare. But the cold grip on my wrist, the raspy breathing filling the room, the impossible readings on the monitors, it all felt too real to be a dream. "What do you want from me?" I managed to ask, my voice shaking. The figure's milky eyes seemed to bore into me. "Remember," it said, "see me, know me, keep me from fading." As it spoke, I noticed something strange happening. The figure's features were becoming clearer, more defined. The matted hair fell away, revealing a face that was almost human. Almost, but not quite. "I don't understand," I said, feeling tears prick at the corners of my eyes. "How can I help you?" "Tell my story," it said, its voice stronger now. "Keep me alive in memory. Break the cycle of forgetting." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. As I watched, the figure seemed to shimmer, its edges becoming blurry and indistinct. "Thank you," it whispered, its voice fading. "Remember." And then, between one blink and the next, it was gone. The bed was empty, the sheets undisturbed. The monitors went dark, plunging the room into silence. I stood there for a long time, staring at the empty bed, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Finally, moving on autopilot, I left the room and continued my rounds. The rest of the night passed in a blur. I kept expecting someone to mention the strange patient in 237 to ask why I hadn't reported it, but no one said anything. It was as if the whole incident had never happened. As my shift ended and I prepared to head home, I found myself drawn back to room 237. It looked normal in the early morning light streaming through the windows. Just another empty hospital room. But as I turned to leave, something caught my eye. There, on the bedside table, was a small, leather-bound notebook. I picked it up with trembling hands, opening it to the first page. Inside, in spidery handwriting that seemed to shift and change as I looked at it, was a single line: "Remember me." I closed the notebook and slipped it into my bag. As I left the hospital, I knew my life had changed forever. I had been chosen as the keeper of a story that defied explanation, a witness to something beyond the realms of normal human experience. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to my core, that I would be back. That room 237 would call to me, again and again. That the figure, the patient forgotten by time itself, would be waiting. Because some stories demand to be told. Some memories refuse to be forgotten. And in the sterile halls of Riverside Hospital, in a room that exists in the cracks between reality, a patient waits. Always waiting. Always forgotten. Until someone remembers. Story 15. The first time it happened, I brushed it off as a fluke. Waking up to find mud on the bedroom floor and leaves in my hair was weird, sure, but I figured I must have forgotten to wipe my feet after a late night walk. It wasn't until the third time that I realized something was terribly wrong. My name's Sam, and up until a month ago, my life was pretty normal. Boring, even. I work from home as a graphic designer, live alone in a small apartment on the edge of town. And my idea of excitement is trying a new flavor of tea. So when I started waking up to evidence of nighttime adventures I couldn't remember, it threw my whole world into chaos. It started small. A dirty footprint here, a misplaced item there. But as the days went on, the signs became more alarming. Scratches on my arms that I couldn't explain. Twigs and burrs caught in my pajamas. Once, I woke up wearing shoes I didn't even own. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe I was sleepwalking, right? It wasn't unheard of. But the nagging voice in the back of my mind kept whispering that this was something more. Something worse. After 2 weeks of increasingly disturbing incidents, I decided to take action. I set up a camera in my bedroom, pointed at the door. Whatever was happening, I was determined to get to the bottom of it. The next morning, I woke up feeling exhausted, like I hadn't slept at all. There was dirt under my fingernails and a smell of pine needles clinging to my skin. With shaking hands, I retrieved the camera and plugged it into my laptop. The footage started normally enough. There I was, climbing into bed around 11 p.m., reading for a bit before turning off the light. For hours, nothing happened. Just the gentle rise and fall of the blankets as I slept. Then, at exactly 3:17 a.m., I sat up. My movements were jerky, unnatural. My eyes were open, but there was something off about them. They looked empty, vacant, like there was no one home behind them. I watched in horror as my on-screen self got out of bed and walked to the door. The camera angle didn't show the hallway, but I could see myself pause in the doorway. Then, slowly, my head turned back towards the camera. A chill ran down my spine. The face looking back wasn't mine. I mean, it was, but not. The features were twisted, stretched into an expression I'd never seen in the mirror. And the eyes. God, the eyes. They were pitch black, like empty sockets, and they seemed to stare right through the camera, right at me. My on-screen self smiled then, a wide, unnatural grin that split my face almost ear to ear. Then, in a fluid motion that made my stomach churn, I walked out of frame. The footage showed nothing for hours after that. Just an empty room, the shadows lengthening as night turned to dawn. At 6:43 a.m., just minutes before my alarm was set to go off, I stumbled back into view. I looked exhausted, dirty, my pajamas torn and stained. I collapsed into bed, and moments later, the Sam on screen jolted awake, looking confused and disoriented. I slammed the laptop shut, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. This couldn't be real. It had to be a dream, a hallucination, anything but reality. But the dirt under my nails, the ache in my muscles, the lingering smell of the outdoors, it was all too real to deny. I spent the day in a daze, unable to focus on work, jumping at every little sound. As night approached, I felt a growing sense of dread. What would happen if I fell asleep? Where would I go? What would I do? I tried to stay awake. I drank coffee, played loud music, even slapped myself a few times. But eventually, exhaustion won out. I felt my eyelids growing heavy, my thoughts becoming sluggish. The last thing I remember is glancing at the clock. 3:16 a.m. I jolted awake to the sound of my own screaming. Sunlight was streaming through the windows, and for a moment, I felt a wave of relief. I'd made it through the night. Then I looked down at my hands. They were covered in blood. Panic overtook me. I rushed to the bathroom, frantically scrubbing at my hands, watching as the water in the sink turned pink. As the blood washed away, I saw deep scratches on my palms and fingers, like I'd been clawing at something, or like something had been clawing at me. With trembling fingers, I picked up my phone and opened the local news app. My heart nearly stopped as I read the headline. Local hiker found dead in woods. Police suspect animal attack. The article described how a man's body had been found in the forest just outside town, about a mile from my apartment. He'd been savagely mauled, the wounds inconsistent with any known predator in the area. I felt sick. This couldn't be a coincidence. But it couldn't be me, right? I wasn't capable of something like that, was I? I called in sick to work and spent the day pacing my apartment, alternating between bouts of panic and desperate attempts to convince myself. It was all just a horrible misunderstanding. As night fell, I knew I couldn't risk falling asleep again. I drove to the 24-hour drugstore and bought every type of stimulant I could find. Energy drinks, caffeine pills, even some sketchy-looking stay-awake supplements. Back home, I set up camp in the living room, TV blaring, lights on full brightness. Hours crawled by. My eyes burned, my head pounded, but I forced myself to stay awake. Every time I felt myself starting to drift off, I'd pinch myself hard or gulp down another energy drink. Around 3 a.m., I started to feel strange. Not tired, exactly, but disconnected, like I was floating just outside my own body. The room seemed to warp and shift around me, shadows dancing at the edges of my vision. And then I saw it, in the reflection of the TV screen, just over my shoulder. A figure, dark, twisted, with those same pitch-black eyes I'd seen in the video. I spun around, heart racing, but there was nothing there. When I looked back at the TV, the reflection was gone. "You're just overtired," I muttered to myself. "You're hallucinating. It's not real." But even as I said it, I felt a presence in the room. Something ancient, hungry, watching me with patient malevolence. As the first rays of dawn began to creep through the windows, I finally allowed myself to relax. I'd done it. I'd made it through the night without sleeping. That's when I heard it. A soft chuckle, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. I froze, my blood turning to ice in my veins. "Did you really think it was that easy?" A voice whispered, and with horror, I realized it was my own voice, but wrong. Distorted, like it was being played backwards and forwards at the same time. I felt my body begin to move, but I wasn't in control. My limbs jerked and twitched, my head twisting at an impossible angle until I was looking back over my shoulder. And there it was. The thing wearing my face, grinning that two-eyed grin, its black eyes boring into mine. "You can't stay awake forever, Sam," it said, my mouth moving, but the words not my own. "And when you sleep, I'll be waiting." I screamed then, a sound of pure terror that tore from my throat. I blinked, and suddenly I was alone again, sprawled on the couch, sunlight streaming through the windows. For a moment, I thought it had all been a nightmare. But then I saw the mud on the carpet, leading from the front door to where I sat. I looked down at my hands, caked with dirt and something darker, flaking off in rust-colored flecks. My phone buzzed with a news alert. Another body found in the woods. I don't know what to do. I can't go to the police. Who would believe me? I can't stay awake forever, and I can't trust myself when I'm asleep. So I'm writing this as a warning. If you see someone who looks like me walking around at night, it's not me. Not really. It's something else. Something wearing my skin like an ill-fitting suit. And if you wake up one day to find evidence of things you don't remember doing, places you don't remember going, don't ignore it. Don't try to explain it away, because it might already be too late. I can feel my eyelids growing heavy as I type this. The sun is setting, and with it, my resolve is fading. I'm so tired. So very tired. And somewhere in the back of my mind, I can hear it laughing. Waiting. Always waiting. Story 16. The brochure had promised serenity, inspiration, and a chance to unlock your inner storyteller. What it failed to mention was the suffocating sense of dread that would settle over me like a shroud, or the growing certainty that I'd made a terrible, possibly fatal mistake in coming here. My name's Rachel, and I'm a writer. Or at least, I'm trying to be. My first novel had been a modest success, but for the past year, I'd been staring at a blank page, the cursor blinking accusingly at me. So when I saw the ad for Whispering Pines Writers Retreat, it seemed like the perfect solution. 2 weeks in a secluded mountain lodge, surrounded by fellow writers, with nothing to do but focus on my craft. What could go wrong? Everything, as it turns out. The drive up to the retreat was beautiful, all winding mountain roads and breathtaking vistas. I arrived just as the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the imposing wooden lodge. A group of about a dozen other writers milled about the entrance, chatting excitedly. I plastered on my best I'm not socially awkward smile and joined them. That's when I first noticed something off. As I approached, the conversation died abruptly. Every head turned to look at me, and for a moment, I could have sworn I saw a flicker of something in their eyes. Disappointment, relief. Before I could puzzle it out, a tall, slender woman with silver hair stepped forward, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "Rachel, welcome," she said, her voice smooth as honey. "We've been expecting you." "I'm Evelyn, the retreat coordinator," as she led me inside. Explaining the schedule and rules, I couldn't shake the feeling that the other writers were watching me. Not with curiosity or friendliness, but with a kind of hungry anticipation that made my skin crawl. My room was cozy, all warm wood and soft fabrics. But as I unpacked, I noticed something strange. The window didn't seem to open, and when I tried the door, I found it locked from the outside. Before I could really process this, there was a knock. Evelyn's voice floated through the door. "Dinner in 10 minutes, Rachel. Don't be late." The lock clicked open. Dinner was weird. The food was delicious, but conversation was stilted and unnatural. Everyone seemed to be waiting for something, though I couldn't fathom what. And they kept staring at me when they thought I wasn't looking. As we finished dessert, Evelyn stood, clinking her glass for attention. "Welcome, writers, to Whispering Pines. You're here to create, to dig deep into your souls and extract the stories within. But remember, once you start a story here, you must finish it, no matter what." Her gaze lingered on me as she said this, and I felt a chill run down my spine. The next few days passed in a blur of writing workshops, nature walks, and increasingly unsettling interactions. I tried to work on my novel, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I found myself scribbling dark, twisted little vignettes. Stories of loss, of terror, of people trapped in situations they couldn't escape. And all the while, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, studied, evaluated. It was on the 4th night that things really started to go sideways. I woke up at 3 a.m., parched. As I stumbled to the bathroom for water, I heard voices in the hallway. I pressed my ear to the door, straining to listen. "Not what we expected," Evelyn was saying, her voice tight with frustration. "The stories aren't right. We may need to push harder." A man's voice responded, low and gravelly. "We're running out of time. If she doesn't produce what we need soon." Their voices faded as they moved away, leaving me with more questions than answers. The next morning, I tried to leave. I packed my bags, made some excuse about a family emergency. But when I got to the parking lot, my car was gone. Evelyn appeared at my elbow, that not quite right smile plastered on her face. "Going somewhere, Rachel. But you haven't finished your story yet. Remember the rules." I looked around wildly, seeking help, but the other writers just watched impassively. Some even looked excited. From that point on, things got worse. My room became my prison. Meals were delivered, but I was no longer allowed to join the others. The only human contact I had was Evelyn, who would visit each day to check on my progress. "Just finish the story, Rachel," she'd say, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "Then you can go home." But I couldn't finish. Every time I tried to write, my hands would shake so badly I could barely hold the pen. The few times I managed to get words on the page, they were feverish ramblings about being trapped, about shadowy figures watching from the corners. As the days wore on, I started to notice changes in the lodge. The hallways seemed longer, twisting in ways that defied the building's layout. Sometimes I'd catch glimpses of impossible things through the cracks in my door. Writhing shadows, rooms that couldn't exist, people who looked almost, but not quite, human. And always, the feeling of being watched, of something waiting, growing impatient. It was on the 10th day that I cracked. I'd been pacing my room, muttering to myself, when suddenly the words started flowing. I grabbed my laptop and began typing furiously, barely aware of what I was writing. The story poured out of me. A tale of a writer trapped in a retreat that wasn't what it seemed. Of ancient, hungry things that fed on creativity, on the raw essence of stories. Of a place that existed in the cracks between worlds, always seeking new voices to add to its chorus of endless, tortured narratives. As I wrote the final word, I felt something shift in the air. The constant pressure of being watched lifted, replaced by a sense of anticipation. My door swung open, revealing Evelyn and the other writers, but they weren't human anymore. Their faces were twisted, elongated, their eyes glowing with an inner light that hurt to look at. Evelyn's mouth stretched into a grin that was far too wide for her face. "You've done it, Rachel. You've finished your story." And what a story it is. As she spoke, the world around us began to warp and twist. The walls of the lodge fell away, revealing an endless expanse of swirling, chaotic energy. And in that maelstrom, I saw countless other writers, their faces contorted in endless screams as they wrote and wrote and wrote. "Welcome," Evelyn said, her voice now a chorus of 1,000 whispers, to the true Whispering Pines, where every story is told, every narrative explored, for all eternity. I tried to run, but there was nowhere to go. The other writers, or the things wearing their shapes, closed in around me. As their cold hands gripped my arms, I realized the horrible truth. I hadn't been writing a story. I'd been writing my own fate. Now, I'm here. In this place beyond places, where time has no meaning and words are both salvation and damnation. I write endlessly, pouring out every story, every idea, every fleeting thought. And with each word, I feel myself fading a little more, becoming part of this hungry, endless narrative. But I haven't given up hope. Not completely. Because you're reading this, aren't you? Somehow, these words have reached you. So let this be a warning and a plea. If you're a writer, be careful where you seek inspiration. Be wary of secluded retreats with too good to be true promises. And if you find yourself at Whispering Pines, or somewhere like it, remember this. Don't finish the story. No matter what they tell you, no matter how they threaten or cajole, don't write that final word. Leave it unfinished, messy, incomplete. It's your only chance. Because once the story is done, once that last period is placed, you become part of it, forever. I have to go now. They're coming, drawn by the act of writing this warning. I can hear them whispering, their voices a cacophony of unfinished tales and half-formed ideas. But know this, as long as someone out there is reading these words, some part of me survives. Some part of me is still fighting. So please, keep reading. Keep this story alive. And whatever you do, don't try to finish it. Because the moment you do, you might find yourself here with me, adding your voice to the endless whispers of whispering pines. Remember, the only safe story is the one that never ends. Story 17. I should have known better than to trust Google Maps in this part of town. The app had promised to shave 15 minutes off my commute, but as I turned down yet another unfamiliar street, I had a sinking feeling that I'd made a terrible mistake. My name's Jack, and I'm what you'd call a creature of habit. Same breakfast every morning, same route to work, same cubicle I've inhabited for the past 5 years. But today, running late for an important meeting, I'd decided to roll the dice on a shortcut. Now, as the suburban sprawl gave way to increasingly dilapidated houses, I was starting to regret my uncharacteristic spontaneity. The first thing I noticed was the silence. No kids playing in yards, no dogs barking, not even the hum of distant traffic. Just the soft purr of my car's engine and the crunch of gravel under my tires. I glanced at my phone, frowning at the unfamiliar street names. Meadowlark Lane, Sycamore Drive, Whisper Street. None of them matched the faded, peeling street signs I was passing. As I turned onto a street called Echoing Hollow Road, which, frankly, sounded more like a bad horror movie setting than a real place, I felt a strange sensation. It was like a shift in air pressure, making my ears pop. For a moment, the world seemed to ripple, like heat waves rising from hot asphalt. I blinked hard, shaking my head to clear it. That's when I noticed the houses. They all looked off somehow. Too similar, with their peeling paint and overgrown yards. And the windows. I could have sworn I saw curtains twitch as I drove past, glimpses of pale faces peering out before quickly disappearing. I checked my phone again, hoping to reorient myself, but the screen was frozen. The little blue dot that represented my car was moving in a perfect circle, never progressing. Frustration mounting, I decided to turn around and try to retrace my steps. But as I made a U-turn, I realized with a jolt of panic that the street behind me wasn't the one I'd just driven down. The houses were different, the trees taller and more gnarled. It was as if the neighborhood was rearranging itself around me. "This is insane," I muttered, gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. "You're just turned around. It's fine." Everything's fine. I picked a direction at random and drove, trying to ignore the way the shadows seemed to lengthen despite it being midday. The houses began to blur together, each one a carbon copy of the last. I found myself driving in loops, always ending up back on Echoing Hollow Road no matter which way I turned. As I passed the same broken-down Chevy on cinder blocks for what felt like the 100th time, movement caught my eye. There, on a sagging porch, sat an old woman in a rocking chair. She wasn't there a moment ago, I was sure of it. As I drove past, her head turned, following my car with an unnatural smoothness. Our eyes met, and I felt a chill run down my spine. Her eyes were milky white, like cataracts, but they seemed to bore right through me. I pressed the gas pedal harder, heart racing. But no matter how fast I drove, the old woman's porch kept pace, always just at the edge of my vision. Every time I looked, she was there, rocking, watching. My fuel gauge caught my attention, the needle dipping dangerously close to empty. Panic clawed at my throat. How long had I been driving? It felt like hours. but my dashboard clock was stuck at 9:47 a.m., the same time I'd entered this nightmare neighborhood. Desperation taking hold, I pulled over, intending to ask for directions or use someone's phone. As I stepped out of the car, the silence hit me like a physical force. No birds, no insects, not even the whisper of wind through leaves. Just a heavy, oppressive quiet that seemed to swallow every sound. I approached the nearest house, its paint peeling in long strips like molting skin. My footsteps on the creaking porch steps sounded impossibly loud in the stillness. I raised my hand to knock, but before I could, the door swung open with a long, pained groan. A man stood there, so pale and thin he seemed almost translucent. His eyes were the same milky white as the old woman's, his smile too wide for his gaunt face. "We've been expecting you, Jack," he said, his voice a dry whisper that somehow carried in the dead air. I stumbled back, nearly falling off the porch. How do you know my name?" His smile widened and possibly further. "We know all about you. We've been waiting so long for you to take the shortcut." I ran, sprinted back to my car, fumbling with the keys as I glanced over my shoulder. The man was still in the doorway, watching, and he wasn't alone anymore. On every porch, in every window, pale faces with milky eyes stared out at me. I finally got the key in the ignition, the engine roaring to life. I slammed the car into drive and peeled out, tires squealing on the asphalt. But as I drove, I realized with growing horror that the neighborhood was changing again. The houses were pressing in closer, the streets narrowing. It was like the whole place was collapsing in on itself, trying to trap me. I took turn after random turn, the steering wheel feeling heavier with each rotation. The houses blurred into a nightmarish smear of faded colors and grasping shadows. And always those watching eyes. Just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore. When the walls of houses were so close I could have reached out and touched them, I saw it. A gap. A way out. Without thinking, I gunned the engine and aimed for the opening. For a moment, everything went dark. There was a sensation of falling, of twisting, like being turned inside out. Then, with a jolt that rattled my teeth, I was back on a normal street, my normal route to work. I slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a stop in the middle of the road. For a long moment, I just sat there, gasping for breath, my hands shaking on the wheel. A horn blared behind me, making me jump. Normal traffic, normal sounds, normal world. As I pulled over to let the angry driver pass, I glanced at my phone. 10:02 a.m. 15 minutes had passed since I'd taken that shortcut. Exactly the amount of time Google Maps had promised I'd save. I made it to work, stumbling into my meeting 10 minutes late and looking like I'd seen a ghost. My colleagues shot me concerned glances, but I waved off their questions with mumbled excuses about traffic. That night, as I drove home along my usual route, I found myself watching the side streets with a new wariness. Every unfamiliar road sign, every glimpse of a neighborhood I didn't recognize sent a shiver down my spine. I tried to convince myself it had all been some kind of stress-induced hallucination, a waking nightmare brought on by too much caffeine and too little sleep. But deep down, I knew the truth. Because sometimes, late at night when the world is quiet, I swear I can hear the creak of a rocking chair. And in my rearview mirror, just at the edge of visibility, I catch glimpses of pale faces with milky eyes, watching, always watching. They're waiting, I think. Waiting for me to get curious, or careless, or simply lost. Waiting for me to take another shortcut. But I won't. No matter how late I'm running, no matter what Google Maps promises, I stick to the roads I know now. Because I've learned the hard way that sometimes the long way around is the only safe path. And if you're reading this, take it as a warning. Be careful of shortcuts, especially ones that seem too good to be true, because you never know where they might lead or what might be waiting at the end. As for me, I've got a long commute ahead. But that's okay. I'd rather be late than lost. Lost in a place where the houses have eyes, the streets have no end, and every road leads back to echoing hollow. Story 18. The key felt unnaturally heavy in my hand, its brass surface cool against my palm. I'd found it tucked away in my grandmother's antique writing desk, labeled with a small tag that simply read basement. But that was impossible. Grandma's house didn't have a basement. At least, not one I'd ever known about. My name's Lily, and I'd spent countless summers in this creaky old Victorian, exploring every nook and cranny. Or so I thought. Now, standing in the dim hallway, key in hand, I felt like I was seeing the house for the first time. The faded wallpaper, the worn hardwood floors, the musty smell of old books. It all seemed slightly off, as if the familiar had suddenly become foreign. Grandma had passed away a month ago, leaving me the unenviable task of clearing out her house. I'd been putting it off, dreading the emotional toll of sifting through a lifetime of memories. But time and the Rialto's gentle prodding had finally forced my hand. I wandered from room to room, the floorboards creaking beneath my feet, half expecting to hear Grandma's voice calling me for lunch or to help her in the garden. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the ticking of the old grandfather clock in the living room. As I passed through the kitchen, something caught my eye. There, in the pantry, partially hidden behind a shelf of dusty canned goods, was a door. A door I'd never noticed before, despite years of raiding this very pantry for snacks. My heart began to race as I approached, the key suddenly feeling like it was burning a hole in my pocket. The door was old, its paint peeling in long strips, revealing dark wood underneath. There was no doorknob, just a small keyhole that seemed to stare at me accusingly. With trembling hands, I inserted the key. It slid in smoothly, as if it had been waiting all these years for this moment. I turned it, hearing the loud click of an ancient lock disengaging. The door swung open with a low, pained groan, revealing a set of stairs descending into darkness. A musty odor wafted up from below, the smell of damp earth and something else I couldn't quite place. Something metallic and vaguely unpleasant. I fumbled for my phone, turning on its flashlight. The beam seemed feeble against the yawning blackness below. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding small and frightened. No response, just the echo of my own voice bouncing back at me. Swallowing hard, I took my first step down. The stair creaked ominously under my weight, but held. Slowly, cautiously, I made my descent. The temperature dropped noticeably with each step, the air growing thick and heavy. By the time I reached the bottom, I was shivering, though whether from cold or fear, I couldn't say. My phone's light revealed a large, open space. Concrete floors, rough stone walls. It looked like a typical old basement, except for one thing. It was filled with filing cabinets. Dozens of them, stretching into the shadows beyond the reach of my light. I approached the nearest cabinet, my footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. The drawer was labeled with a year, 1985, my birth year. With a sense of trepidation, I pulled it open. Inside were files, each bearing a name. I recognized some: childhood friends, neighbors, even my parents. But it was my own name that drew my attention. With shaking hands, I opened the file. Inside were photos, hundreds of them. Me as a baby, taking my first steps. Me on my first day of school, at my high school graduation. Moments I remembered, and many I didn't. But they weren't just random snapshots. Each photo was annotated with meticulous notes in my grandmother's familiar handwriting. Lily, age 7, shows increasing independence, potential for divergence from desired path. Intervention may be necessary. Lily, age 16, first boyfriend. Relationship terminated as per protocol. Subjects unaware of interference. My mind reeled. What was this? Some kind of twisted record keeping. And what did she mean by intervention and protocol? I moved to another cabinet, this one labeled 2010. Inside, I found more files, more photos. People I'd met in college, co-workers from my first job, all with similar annotations. David Reynolds. Potential negative influence on subject. Friendship discouraged through subtle manipulation. Sarah Chun. Aligned with project goals. Friendship encouraged. Cold sweat beaded on my forehead as the implications began to sink in. My entire life, every relationship, every major decision, had it all been orchestrated, manipulated by my sweet cookie-baking grandmother. I staggered back, bumping into another cabinet. It toppled with a thunderous crash, files spilling across the floor. As I scrambled to regain my balance, my phone's light swept across the far wall, revealing something that made my blood run cold. A door. Not the one I'd entered through, but a heavy metal door with a small, barred window. And beyond that window, I could have sworn I saw movement. A pale face, there and gone in an instant. Heart pounding, I approached the door. The window was grimy, covered in years of dust. But as I wiped it clean, I could make out a long corridor beyond. And lining that corridor were more doors. Dozens of them. A sound from behind one of the doors made me jump. A soft thud, followed by what sounded like scratching. Then, faintly, a voice. "Hello, is someone there, please? Help me." I stumbled back, my mind refusing to process what I was seeing, what I was hearing. This couldn't be real. It had to be some kind of nightmare. As if in response to my thoughts, a loud click echoed through the basement. The door at the top of the stairs had shut. I ran to it, taking the steps 2 at a time, but it was no use. It was locked. The key used us from this side. Panic rising in my throat, I turned back to the room, my phone's light sweeping wildly across the space. That's when I noticed something I'd missed before. On each filing cabinet, below the year, was a small symbol, a circle with intricate patterns inside it. The same symbol I'd seen countless times on my grandmother's jewelry, on the stationery she used. I'd always thought it was just a quirky personal logo. Now, looking at it in this context, it seemed sinister, alien. A loud grinding noise filled the air, and I watched in horror as the metal door began to open. From the darkness beyond, I heard shuffling footsteps. Many of them. I backed away, looking desperately for a way out, a weapon, anything. My foot hit something solid. A crowbar, half hidden under a fallen file. I snatched it up, holding it in front of me like a shield. The first figure emerged from the doorway. It was human-shaped, but wrong somehow. Too pale, too thin, its movements jerky and unnatural. As it stepped into the light, I saw its face, or rather, the lack of one. Where features should have been was just smooth, blank skin. More followed, an army of faceless beings, all moving with that same unsettling gait. And behind them, a figure I recognized. My grandmother, but not as I'd known her. This version was younger, vital, her eyes gleaming with an unnatural light. "Oh, Lily," she said, her voice both familiar and utterly foreign. "You weren't supposed to find this." "Not yet. We had such plans for you." I opened my mouth to speak, to scream, to demand answers. But before I could, one of the faceless creatures was upon me. Its touch was ice cold, its grip inhumanly strong. As it dragged me towards the open door, towards that long corridor lined with imprisoned souls, I heard my grandmother's voice one last time. "Don't worry, dear. Soon you won't remember any of this. And then we can start over. We have all the time in the world to get it right." The metal door clanged shut behind me, plunging me into darkness. And as I felt my memories, my very sense of self beginning to slip away, one thought burned bright in my fading consciousness. Sometimes, the things hidden in basements should stay hidden. And sometimes, the most monstrous truths were the face of those we love most. I don't know how long I've been here. Days, years. Time has no meaning in this place. But if you're reading this, if you've found your way to that basement, to those filing cabinets full of stolen lives, remember this. Not all family trees have roots. Some have tentacles, and they reach farther and hold tighter than you could ever imagine. Be careful what doors you open. You never know what might be waiting on the other side. Story 19. The first call came on a Tuesday. I was elbow deep in paperwork when my phone buzzed, my best friend Jake's name flashing on the screen. I answered, expecting our usual banter about weekend plans or the latest office gossip. Instead, his voice came through tight with anger. "What the hell, man? I thought we were friends." I blinked, caught off guard. We are. What are you talking about? Don't play dumb. You blew me off last night, then had the nerve to trash talk me to Sarah. Not cool, dude. My mind raced. Last night, I'd been home alone, binge watching a new series, and I hadn't spoken to Sarah, Jake's girlfriend, in weeks. "Jake, I have no idea what you're talking about. I was home all night." There was a long pause. When Jake spoke again, his voice was uncertain. You really don't remember? We met at O'Malley's. You were acting weird, saying all this stuff about how Sarah deserves better. Then you just left without a word. A chill ran down my spine. "Jake, I swear to you, I was nowhere near O'Malley's last night. This has to be some kind of misunderstanding." More silence then. "All right, man, if you say so. But something weird is going on here." As I hung up, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling settling in my gut. Jake wasn't the type to make this stuff up, but I knew, with absolute certainty, that I'd been home last night, hadn't I? I tried to push the incident out of my mind, chalking it up to a bizarre misunderstanding. But over the next few days, more calls came. My sister, furious about some harsh comments I'd supposedly made about her new boyfriend. A co-worker thanking me for covering his shift when I'd done no such thing. My neighbor asking when I wanted the lawnmower back. A lawnmower I'd never borrowed. Each time, the story was the same. Someone had seen me, talked to me, interacted with me in ways I had no memory of. And each time, I felt that chill of unease grow stronger. It came to a head on Friday night. I was at a work function nursing a drink in the corner and trying to avoid small talk when I saw her. Sarah, Jake's girlfriend, making a beeline for me with fire in her eyes. Before I could even open my mouth to say hello, her hand connected with my cheek in a stinging slap that left my ears ringing. "How dare you?" she hissed, her voice low but intense. "After everything Jake's done for you, how could you try to kiss me?" The room seemed to spin around me. "What? Sarah, I never. Don't lie to me," she cut me off. "It was yesterday, at the coffee shop on 5th. You said all these things about how Jake doesn't appreciate me, how you've always had feelings for me, and then you tried to kiss me. I've never been so disgusted in my life." My mind reeled. Yesterday I'd been in meetings all day, never even left the office. There was no way. But even as I stammered out denials, I saw the certainty in Sarah's eyes. She believed what she was saying with every fiber of her being. As Sarah stormed off, leaving me standing there with a burning cheek and a room full of curious onlookers, I felt something inside me snap. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't a series of coincidences. Something was very, very wrong. I left the party in a daze, my mind churning. As I walked to my car, movement caught my eye. A figure, just at the edge of my peripheral vision, ducking into an alley. For a split second, I could have sworn I saw a flash of familiar features. My features. Heart pounding, I followed. The alley was dark, littered with trash and reeking of stale beer. As my eyes adjusted to the gloom, I saw him. Me, but not me. He stood at the far end of the alley, a mirror image down to the small scar on my chin from a childhood bike accident. But his eyes, God, his eyes were wrong. Cold, empty, with a glint of something that made my blood run cold. "Who are you?" I managed to choke out, my voice barely above a whisper. He smiled, a twisted parody of my own grin. "I'm you, of course. The better you. The you that does all the things you're too afraid to do." I shook my head, backing away. "This isn't possible. You can't be real." His laugh was my laugh, but hollower somehow. "Oh, I'm very real. And I'm just getting started." Before I could respond, he turned and sprinted away, disappearing around a corner. I gave chase, my heart pounding in my ears, but when I rounded the corner, the street was empty. He had vanished into the night. The next few weeks were a nightmare. More incidents, more angry calls and confused messages. My doppelganger was everywhere, saying and doing things I never would, leaving a trail of chaos in his wake. I tried to explain, to tell people about the imposter, but who would believe such an insane story? I became paranoid, jumping at every shadow, scrutinizing every reflective surface. Was that really me in the mirror, or him? When I spoke, were the words really mine, or his? My relationships crumbled. Friends stopped returning my calls. Family members regarded me with a mix of concern and wariness. At work, whispers followed me down the hallways. I was coming undone, and everyone could see it. One night, unable to sleep, I found myself driving aimlessly through the city. As I passed a 24-hour diner, something made me stop. There, in the window, I saw him. Me, sitting at a booth, chatting animatedly with a group of my friends. Friends who hadn't spoken to me in weeks. Rage boiled up inside me. Without thinking, I stormed into the diner, marching straight to the table. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" I demanded. The conversation stopped abruptly. My friends looked up at me, their expressions a mix of confusion and alarm. But my doppelganger just smiled, that cold, empty smile. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice a perfect imitation of my own. "Do I know you?" I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. "What are you talking about? You're me. You're ruining my life." My friends exchanged worried glances. Jake stood up, placing a hand on my shoulder. "Buddy, I think you've had too much to drink. Maybe you should go home." I shrugged off his hand, my eyes never leaving the imposter's face. "Can't you see? That's not me. I'm me." But even as the words left my mouth, I saw the doubt in their eyes. The way they looked at him, at me, with familiarity and concern. And the way they looked at me, the real me, with fear and confusion. "I think you should leave," my doppelganger said softly, his eyes gleaming with triumph. Before I have to call the police, I stood there, frozen as the realization washed over me. He had won. Somehow, impossibly, he had taken my place. My life, my identity. As security escorted me out of the diner, I caught one last glimpse of him through the window. He was laughing with my friends, his arm around Sarah's shoulders, looking for all the world like he belonged there, like he was me. I don't know how long I drove after that. Hours, maybe. The city gave way to suburbs, then to dark, winding country roads. My mind was a maelstrom of confusion and despair. Who was I, if not myself? If he was me, then who was I? As dawn broke, I found myself parked at a scenic overlook, staring out at a misty valley below. In the rearview mirror, I saw movement in the back seat. I turned, already knowing what I'd see. He sat there, smiling that cold smile. "It's over," he said. "You know that, right? I'm you now. I always have been. The you that you were too afraid to be." I nodded slowly, a strange calm settling over me. "So what happens now?" His smile widened, revealing teeth that seemed just a little too sharp. Now you fade away. Become a stranger in your own life. Watch as I live it better than you ever could." As he spoke, I felt myself growing hazy, insubstantial. My hands on the steering wheel seemed to flicker, like a bad TV signal. "Or," he continued, his voice dropping to a whisper, "you could join me. Become what you were always meant to be. After all, two of us are better than one, right?" I met his eyes in the mirror, those cold, empty eyes that I now recognized as my own. And in that moment, I made my choice. I don't know who's writing this now, the original me, the doppelganger, or some new fusion of the two. All I know is that if you see me out there at a party, at work, walking down the street, you might want to take a closer look. Because you never know which me you might be talking to. And trust me, you really, really want to know the difference. After all, I'm out there, watching, waiting, ready to become the you that you're too afraid to be. Are you ready to meet the real you? Story 20. The first frame was empty, just a serene forest scene bathed in early morning light. It wasn't until I reviewed the footage later that night that I saw it. A dark figure standing at the tree line, so still it might have been a trick of the shadows. But as I flicked through the subsequent images, a chill ran down my spine. With each frame, it was closer. My name's Maya, and I'm a nature photographer. Or at least, I was. Now, I'm not sure what I am. A witness to something impossible, maybe. A prisoner of my own fear. Or perhaps I'm just losing my mind. It started as a simple project. I'd been commissioned to capture the changing seasons in Willow Creek Forest, a sprawling wilderness area just outside of town. The plan was to set up a time-lapse camera and let it run for months, capturing the subtle shifts from summer to fall, fall to winter. I've done it dozens of times before. Wake up before dawn, hike out to the perfect spot, set up my gear, and let nature do the rest. This time should have been no different. The morning I set up the camera was picture perfect. A light mist hung over the forest floor, the air crisp with the first hint of autumn. As I secured the camera to its tripod, adjusting the lens to capture the sweeping vista before me, I felt that familiar thrill of anticipation. What wonders would this patient I witness in the coming months, if only I'd known. I spent the day scouting other locations, snapping test shots and enjoying the solitude. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, I made my way back to the time-lapse setup for one final check before heading home. That's when I first felt it. A prickling sensation on the back of my neck, like I was being watched. I spun around, half expecting to see a curious deer or perhaps another hiker. But the forest was empty, silent save for the rustle of leaves in the gentle evening breeze. Shaking off the feeling, I packed up my gear and headed home, eager to review the day's test footage. It wasn't until late that night, as I sat at my computer flicking through the images, that I saw it. Frame 37, 10:17 a.m. There, at the very edge of the frame, barely visible among the trees, was a figure. Tall, unnaturally thin, its features obscured by shadow. My first thought was that it must be a hiker who had wandered into frame. But as I moved to the next image, taken 15 minutes later, my blood ran cold. The figure was closer now, and in the clear morning light, I could see that it wasn't human. Not even close. Its limbs were too long, too jointed. Its head, if you could call it that, was oddly elongated, featureless save for two pinpricks of light where eyes should be. With trembling hands, I flicked through the rest of the day's images. In each one, the figure was closer. By the final frame, taken just before sunset, it was at the center of the image. Its blank face turned directly toward the camera, directly toward where I had been standing. I slammed my laptop shut, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. This couldn't be real. It had to be a trick of the light, or maybe some elaborate prank. But deep down, I knew. Whatever I had captured on camera was real, and it had been watching me. I barely slept that night, my dreams plagued by visions of that elongated figure gliding through the trees, always just out of sight. When morning came, I was exhausted but determined. I had to go back, had to see for myself. The forest seemed different as I hiked back to my camera setup. The cheerful birdsong and dappled sunlight that had so enchanted me yesterday now felt like a thin veneer, masking something dark and ancient that lurked just out of sight. As I approached the clearing where I'd left my camera, that feeling of being watched returned, stronger than ever. My palms were slick with sweat as I unclipped the camera from its tripod, fumbling to remove the memory card. That's when I heard it. A sound so soft I almost missed it. The snap of a twig underfoot, but not my foot. I spun around, nearly dropping the camera in my haste, and there it was, standing at the edge of the clearing, just as it had appeared in the photos. Tall, thin, and possibly still. Those pinprick eyes fixed on me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. For a long moment, neither of us moved. I couldn't have run if I wanted to. My legs felt rooted to the spot, my breath caught in my throat. Then, with a fluidity that defied physics, it took a step forward, No, not a step. It was there, and then it was closer, with no movement in between, like frames missing from a film. I stumbled backward, my survival instinct finally kicking in. I turned to run, my feet pounding against the forest floor as I fled blindly through the trees. Branches whipped at my face, roots threatened to trip me, but I didn't slow down. I couldn't. I don't know how long I ran. It felt like hours, but the sun had barely moved in the sky when I finally burst out of the tree line, gasping for breath. My car sat where I'd left it in the small parking area, a beacon of normality in a world gone mad. As I fumbled with my keys, I dared to look back. The forest stood silent and still, no sign of my otherworldly pursuer. But I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to my core, that it was still out there, watching, waiting. I broke every speed limit on the way home, my hand shaking so badly I could barely keep the car on the road. Once safely inside my apartment, doors locked and curtains drawn, I finally allowed myself to breathe. The memory card from the camera felt like it was burning a hole in my pocket. Part of me wanted to destroy it, to pretend none of this had ever happened, but a larger part needed to know, needed to understand. With trembling hands, I inserted the card into my computer. The new images loaded slowly, each one ratcheting up my anxiety. At first, they showed only the empty forest, beautiful and serene in the early morning light. Then, frame 127, there it was. Closer than ever before, its elongated form taking up nearly half the frame. But it wasn't looking at the camera anymore. No, its featureless face was turned, those pinprick eyes focused on something out of frame, on the spot where I had been standing when I removed the camera. The next image made my blood run cold. The figure was gone, but there, in the bottom corner of the frame, was a hand. My hand, reaching toward the camera. Except it wasn't my hand. Not really. The fingers were too long, the joints too numerous, and the skin was changing, stretching, becoming the pale, otherworldly texture I had seen on the figure. The final image was just static, a burst of visual noise that hurt my eyes to look at. But in that chaos, I could just make out a face. My face, but wrong. Elongated, featureless, save for 2 pinpricks of light where my eyes should be. I slammed the laptop shut, bile rising in my throat. What had I captured? What had I become? That was 3 days ago. I haven't left my apartment since. I've called in sick to work, ignored the knocks on my door, the concerned messages from friends. How can I face them? How can I be sure that what they see when they look at me is really me? Because sometimes, when I catch my reflection in a mirror or a darkened window, I see it. Just for a split second, that elongated face, those pinprick eyes, the thing from the forest, wearing my skin like an ill-fitting suit. I don't know what to do. I don't know if there's anything I can do. All I know is that time isn't what I thought it was. It's not a steady flow, but a series of frames, with horrors lurking in the spaces between. And something is out there, moving through those spaces, watching, waiting, coming closer with each frame, each blink, each heartbeat. I'm writing this as a warning. If you're ever in Willow Creek Forest, and you feel that prickling sensation on the back of your neck, don't look back. Don't take pictures. Just run. Because once it's seen you, once it's chosen you, it's only a matter of time. And time, as I've learned, is far more flexible and far more terrifying than we ever imagined. I hear footsteps outside my door now, slow and deliberate. not human footsteps. I know it's come for me. In the next frame, the next blink, the next heartbeat, it will be here, and I will be gone. Remember me. And whatever you do, don't look too closely at the spaces between moments. You never know what might be looking back.